Committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to a length limitation in the rules. Before I begin, I want to make the big announcement that today is Mr. McCaul's birthday, so happy birthday, Mr. McCaul.
I'm 35 years once again.
Me too. Pursuant to notice, we're here today to examine Trump administration policy towards Iran. I welcome our panel of distinguished witnesses. Welcome to members of the public and the press as well. We had hoped to hear from Secretary Pompeo today as well. After we invited him, he announced that he would instead be in California. That's unfortunate, whether you agree with this administration's approach to Iran or not. I don't think there is a member of this committee who doesn't want to hear from Mr. Pompeo, and the American people certainly deserve to hear answers with our troops and diplomats being asked to stand in harm's way. But this committee will conduct oversight on this issue one way or another. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Under the Trump administration, we've seen tensions with Iran ratchet up bit by bit to a point earlier this month when it seemed we were on the brink of war. Iran bears much of the blame for this escalation. The regime is the world's most prolific state sponsor of terrorism and believes that provocative and destabilizing behavior strengthens its hand. It's what we expect from Iran. What's helped stave off calamity for 4 decades is that the United States doesn't behave that way. We don't play on Iran's turf. Being a world leader means you don't emulate your adversaries. You use your power judiciously by trying to change behavior while seeking to diffuse conflict and prevent bloodshed. That's why the killing of Qasem Soleimani was such a shock. Not because Soleimani was a good guy, just the opposite. He had the blood of many Americans on his hands. He was a hardened terrorist. Democrats and Republicans alike know the world is better off without him. But killing him was a massive escalation. Those who wrongly view him as a martyr have already used his death as a pretext for violence and retribution. Americans have been warned to leave Iraq and have been threatened with kidnapping. Iranian missiles have struck bases where Americans are stationed. Thousands more men and women in uniform have been deployed to the region. The Iraqi parliament has asked our troops to leave the country, even though we rely on that partnership in the fight against ISIS. Fortunately, for the moment, both the administration and the Iranians have taken a step back. But we have to ask, why was it worth turning the simmer up to a boil? That's where things start to get confusing. At first, the administration said there was an imminent threat. Why is that important? Because in the case of an imminent threat, the President has authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect Americans. No one doubts that. But then we heard the strike went forward because Soleimani did so many bad things in the past and was plotting for the future. Then when that didn't work, they went back to an imminent threat, but we didn't know where or when it would take place. In fact, we don't even know if it was imminent, which makes you wonder if the word imminent still has any meaning. Next, an embassy was going to be attacked. Then 4 embassies were going to be attacked. Then maybe it wasn't 4 embassies. Then it's widely reported that there was another failed strike on a different Iranian Quds Force official in Yemen. So what was the justification for the strike which killed General Soleimani? Surely neither of the existing war authorizations, the post-9/11 authorization or the 2002 Iraq war authorization, could possibly be contorted into an explanation for attacking Iran in Yemen. Finally, the administration's rather heavy reliance on the 2002 law, which authorized the war against Saddam Hussein, is especially dubious. Was there any legal basis whatsoever for this strike that took us to the brink of open hostilities with Iran? We're not asking these questions because we mourn the death of Soleimani or sympathize with terrorists. And let me say right now that I won't tolerate any member of this committee making that sort of accusation against other members of his body, even in a general sense. We are all patriotic Americans, Democrats, and Republicans alike. We're asking these questions because the American people don't want to go to war with Iran. We're asking these questions because Congress has not authorized war with Iran. As we reaffirmed on the House floor last week, we're asking these questions because war powers are vested in the Congress, and if we allow any administration to carry out strikes like these to risk plunging us into war without scrutiny, then we might as well cross out Article 1, Section 8. I wanted Secretary Pompeo here today because I think the administration is not being straight with the country or the Congress. And whether you thought the Soleimani strike was a good idea or not, if you believe that Congress is a co-equal branch of government and that we need to take back the constitutional powers we've given away to successive administrations, then I hope you'll join me in saying we need answers on the record in an open setting so the American people can know the truth. We will not be deterred from our oversight efforts. Since Secretary Pompeo isn't here, I'm sending him a letter today, as well as to Secretary Esper, demanding that they produce information on the legal basis for the strike that took out Soleimani and on a range of other topics. I will make those letters part of the record of this hearing. I hope our witnesses can shed some light on these topics as well. I will recognize each of you to make an opening statement. And let me just say that if Secretary Pompeo is not going to cooperate with the committee, then we will consider very strongly taking other actions in the future, including subpoenas. So I will recognize each of you to make an opening statement, pending which I yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. McCaul of Texas, for any opening statements he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I will not repeat the arguments I made on the House floor last week during the War Powers debate, other than to say that the world is safer without Qasem Soleimani, Iran's terror commander on the battlefield. And I think that is something, Mr. Chairman, I think you and I both agree on this. Former Obama DH Secretary, friend of mine, and DOD General Counsel Jay Johnson said that Soleimani was a, quote, lawful military objective and that no further congressional authorization was necessary. I agree with the former Obama administration cabinet member. I've talked to him extensively about this strike. He used to authorize these strikes under the Obama administration. They conducted thousands of them. I wish Democrats would join in praising the president as Republicans did when Osama bin Laden was killed. In many ways, Soleimani was just as important, if not more important, of a target. And I know that my colleagues on the other side are also relieved that this threat has been eliminated, but they may not be able to say so as much publicly. I wish they were more willing to recognize that the administration made the right decision in taking out Soleimani. Debating issues of war and peace is perhaps our most important responsibility on this committee and as members of Congress. And I'm glad that we are finally exerting our jurisdiction under Article 1, as I'm sure we are not done dealing with this issue. Soleimani, make no mistake, was a mastermind of terror in the Middle East for over 2 decades. He was designated as a terrorist by President Obama. He was responsible for the deaths of over 600 Americans and wounded thousands of more. Last year, Iran attacked 6 commercial ships and downed a U.S. drone. Beginning in October, Soleimani orchestrated 11 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq, killing an American and wounding 4 U.S. service members. Soleimani ordered an attack on our embassy in Baghdad, and the damage was extensive as shown in these pictures. We are lucky that no embassy personnel were hurt or taken hostage. 2 days after the attack on our embassy, the administration struck Soleimani because, to quote Secretary Pompeo, he was actively plotting to take big action that would put dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. lives at risk. This was an imminent threat. Chairman of Joint Chiefs General Milley said the administration would have been culpably negligent if they had not acted. And what if the president had not acted and more Americans were killed in an attack directed by Soleimani? What would the president's critics have said then? I believe, in having been in the White House, the president has shown great restraint regarding Iran. Many other presidents may have struck after the drone was downed. Many other presidents may have struck after the American was killed. Many other presidents would strike after the embassy was attacked. How many Americans and how many embassies need to be attacked before we respond? He's been clear and has told me personally just last week that he does not want war with Iran. He wants to de-escalate, not escalate. And he's been very clear with his strategy on Iran. As he told the nation on Wednesday, he wants a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper, provided that Iran finally ends its destabilizing activities in the Middle East. Iran needs to stop its nuclear program, stop developing ballistic missiles, stop supporting terrorists and proxies, stop taking hostages, stop oppressing its own people, and act as a responsible, normal nation, as a normal nation would on the world stage. And for the second time in recent months, the Iranian people are bravely protesting the conduct of this theocratic, despotic regime. Protesters across Iran are furious because the regime shot down a commercial airliner just last week, killing 176 innocent people, many of whom were Iranian. And even worse, the regime did not even admit to having done it for 3 days. They intentionally lied to their own people and to the world. We are already seeing allegations, including video footage, depicting the regime's violence against its protesters. These are human rights violations. An Iranian Olympic medalist announced this week that she was defecting Iran because of the hypocrisy, lies, injustice, and flattery. Yesterday, Iran's state TV anchor resigned after more than 13 years, saying, quote, "It was very hard for me to believe the killing of my countrymen. I apologize for lying to you on TV for 13 years. In November, the Iranian regime brutally suppressed popular protest sparked by an increase in gasoline prices, shutting down the internet, and then killing 1,500 of their own citizens. Let me be clear, we stand with the people of Iran, demanding accountability from their leaders. And I want to thank the President for loudly and clearly defending the rights of the Iranian people and urging the regime not to use violence against them. I'd like to close by focusing on Iraq. The United States supports a strong, sovereign, and prosperous Iraq. Those responsible for violence against protesters and journalists must be held accountable, including for the killing of 2 journalists in Basra this weekend. We stand with the Iraqi people and support their right to freely assemble. We will always support freedom wherever it is. We will always support human rights wherever it is a struggle. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the witnesses. I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as the senior Middle East advisor to President George H.W. Bush, as the State Department's Director of Policy Planning under Secretary of State Colin Powell, and in various positions in the Defense and State Departments during the Carter and Reagan administrations. He was also U.S. Coordinator for Policy toward the future of Afghanistan and the U.S. envoy to both the Cyprus and Northern Ireland peace talks. Avril Haines is a senior research scholar at Columbia University, a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and a principal at West Exec Advisors. During the last administration, Ms. Haines served as assistant to the President and Principal Deputy National Security Advisor. She also served as the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency and legal advisor to the National Security Council, in addition to other senior legal positions at the State Department and the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Stephen Hadley is a principal of Rice Hadley Gates, LLC, an international strategic consulting firm. Mr. Hadley is also board chair of the United States Institute of Peace and an executive vice chair of the board of directors of the Atlantic Council. Mr. Hadley served for 4 years as the assistant to the President for National Security Affairs from 2005 to 2009. From 2001 to 2005, Mr. Hadley was the assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor serving under then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Mr. Hadley had previously served on the National Security Council staff and in the Defense Department, including an Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy from 1989 to 1993. So I thank all witnesses for joining us. Without objection, your complete prepared testimony will be made part of the record. I'll now recognize you each for 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement, and we'll begin with Dr. Haass.
Mike. Now with my mic on. Thank you and good morning. Let me say that recent events that we're discussing here today did not take place in a vacuum. They can only be understood against the backdrop of nearly 3/4 of a century of history, in particular recent history. Here I would highlight the American decision in 2018 to exit the 2015 nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and the decision to introduce significant sanctions against Iran. These sanctions constituted a form of economic warfare. Iran was not in a position to respond in kind and instead instituted a series of military actions meant to make the United States and others pay a price for these sanctions and therefore to conclude they needed to be removed. It is also important, I believe, to point out here that the United States did not provide a diplomatic alternative to Iran when it imposed these sanctions. This was the context in which the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani took place. This event needs to be assessed from 2 vantage points. One is legality. It would have been justified to attack Soleimani if he was involved in mounting a military action that was imminent. If there is evidence that can responsibly be made public, supporting these criteria were met of imminence, it should be. If, however, it turns out the criteria were not met, that what took place was an action of choice rather than necessity, I fear it will lead to an open-ended conflict between the United States and Iran, fought in many places with many tools and few red lines that will be observed. The President tweeted yesterday that the question of imminence doesn't really matter. I would respectfully disagree. Imminence is central to the concept of preemption, which is treated in international law as a legitimate form of self-defense. Preventive attacks, though, are something very different. They are mounted against a gathering threat rather than an imminent one, and a world of regular preventive actions would be one in which conflict was prevalent. It's even more important to assess the wisdom of the targeted killing. There's no doubt, as the chairman said, that Mr. Soleimani had blood on his hands and was a force for instability in the region, and I don't know of any critic of the strike who mourns his loss. But just because Soleimani was evil, and just because killing him may have been legally justifiable, does not make it wise. And here I have several doubts. First, there were other and I believe better ways to reestablish deterrence with Iran. Secondly, the killing interrupted what I believe were useful political dynamics in both Iran and Iraq. Thirdly, U.S.-Iraqi ties were deeply strained. Fourthly, we've been forced to send more forces to the region rather than make them available elsewhere. Fifthly, given our worldwide challenges, I do not believe it is in our strategic interest to have a new war in the Middle East. And sixth, Iran has already announced plans to take steps at odds with the JCPOA, which will shrink the window it needs to build a nuclear weapon if it decides to do so. And if this happens, it will present both the United States and Israel with difficult and potentially costly choices. I'm fully confident that many of you will disagree with part or all of my assessment, but however we got here, we are where we are. So let me just say a few things about where we are, what we can expect, and let me make a few policy recommendations. First, the pause in military exchanges between the United States and Iran is just that, a pause. Iran is not standing down. It will continue to take military actions against the United States, I believe, as well as our allies. Secondly, President Trump was clear that Iran will never be able to have a nuclear weapon. This stance is welcome, but it is insufficient. Iran must also be denied attaining what I would describe as a near-nuclear capability. If it were to achieve such a capability, there's the danger at some point it would sprint to put together a small nuclear force and present the world with the fait accompli, and the fact it might do this would be more than enough to persuade several of its neighbors to do the same. Such a scenario would be a strategic and humanitarian nightmare. The JCPOA was intended to lessen the odds that such a scenario would come about. We can discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the JCPOA in detail. Let me say one thing that I know will come up about it, that I understand the JCPOA did not constrain Iran's regional activities. Some would see that as a flaw. I would simply say arms control cannot be expected to accomplish everything. And if we insist that it do so, we run the risk it will accomplish nothing. Some things like pushing back against what Iran is doing in the region, that's something we and our friends have to do for ourselves. That was a central lesson of the Cold War. Grand bargains seek the perfect at the expense of the possible. Let me just make a few recommendations, and I know my time is growing short. One, the United States should work closely with its allies and other signatories of the JCPOA to put together the outlines of a new agreement. Call it JCPOA 2.0 and present Iran with a new deal. It would establish longer-term, or better yet, open-ended limits on Iran's nuclear missile programs in exchange for sanctions relief. Congress should approve any such agreement to remove the concern that this pact could be easily undone by any president, and such initiatives should emerge from consultation with allies. Our policy toward Iran has become overly unilateral and is less effective for it. This proposal should be specific, reasonable, and articulated in public, and I want to emphasize the latter. The reason it should be talked about publicly is we should pressure the government in Tehran to explain to the Iranian people why it rejects a fair proposal that would reduce sanctions and raise the standard of living for all Iranians, just so it can pursue its foreign policy and national surety goals. And recent protests against the government, against the backdrop of sanctions, create a good context for such a sincere public initiative. We must also understand that in the wake of exiting the JCPOA and introducing new sanctions, we brought about a dangerous situation in which Iran is slowly but steadily breaking out of the constraints of the accord. It will reduce the time it would need to construct nuclear weapons if it decides to do so. It is essential, I would argue, that Iran understand the limits to what we are prepared to tolerate. This should be communicated to them, and a message should be coordinated with our allies, our Arab neighbors, and with Iran's Arab neighbors, and with Israel. We should act immediately to repair our relationship with Iraq. We do not want to open Iraq to greater Iranian influence, nor do we want to see a reconstitution of terrorism inside its borders. The threat of sanctions against Iraq ought to be removed. So too should the threat to remain absent Iraqi permission. A true presence that comes to be seen as an occupation will be forced to spend its time protecting itself and will be unable to partner with Iraqi forces against terrorists. Last but not least, let me just make one other point about the need to accept political reality. Regime change in Iran is unlikely. The Islamic Republic is resilient. But even if this assessment one day proves wrong, there's no way of knowing that it will prove wrong or when it might. As a result, regime change cannot be the basis of U.S. strategy. It is beyond our capacity to engineer. And recent events around the region ought to have taught us that even when regime change happens, it's not necessarily a panacea in terms of what comes afterwards. What we do need is a strategy for dealing with the Iran that exists and policies consistent with that strategy. Our objective should be to change Iran's behavior, to negotiate an outcome in the nuclear and missile realms acceptable to both countries, and through our actions in the region, to lead Iran to conclude that it will fail if it continues to try to destabilize the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to appear here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haass. Ms. Haines.
Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCaul. Happy birthday, and distinguished members of the committee. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm honored.
Can you move the mic closer?
Absolutely.
I don't
Is
know
that
if-
better?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm honored to be here today to discuss U.S. policy regarding Iran and whether it is likely to serve our longer-term objectives in the region. During my time in government, our goals were to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to diminish and counter Iran's threatening and destabilizing behavior, from its growing ballistic missile arsenal to its dangerous use of regional proxies to its human rights abuses at home, all while avoiding a war. And these are still the right goals, in my view, and in fact, they are not dissimilar to those articulated by the current administration. And I am concerned, however, that the approach being taken right now, including in particular the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, is not one that well serves these goals. A fundamental pillar of U.S.-Iran policy was the JCPOA, which was at the center of our efforts precisely because we realized that a nuclear-armed Iran would make the broader challenges harder to address. While not perfect, the JCPOA cut off Iran's pathways to acquiring a bomb and significantly constrained Iran's nuclear program. The JCPOA was never intended to stand alone, but rather was seen as part of a wider regional strategy that sought to reduce Iran's destabilizing influence in the region, strengthen those voices in Iran who were pushing back against the Iranian government's threatening policies, and engage Iran diplomatically to avoid inadvertent escalation, while also putting pressure on the Iranian regime to change Iran's unacceptable behavior at home and abroad. Walking away from the JCPOA and imposing new sanctions on Iran drove a wedge between the United States and our long-term allies in Europe, while the pressure of those sanctions has been formidable, the result has been that Iran conducted increasingly provocative actions in the Gulf and restarted significant aspects of their suspended nuclear program. And American allies and partners, rather than helping us address Iranian behavior, are instead concerned with what they perceive to be unpredictable and escalatory behavior on part of both countries, and have focused their efforts on trying to de-escalate the situation. And meanwhile, the withdrawal from the JCPOA strengthened hardline voices in Tehran, and we are now without real hope for another deal that would further restrict Iran's nuclear program, let alone any other destabilizing activities such as their ballistic missile program. And this was predictable. Economic pressure on Iran can, as it did in the lead up to the JCPOA, affect the domestic political calculus associated with making a deal. But no Iranian analyst will tell you that economic sanctions are likely to have a meaningful impact on the regime's capacity to engage in destabilizing actions in the region. This is because the availability of resources for foreign proxies, a relatively small budget line item, has never been a serious constraint on Iran's regional interference. And moreover, to avoid disrupting the deal, the JCPOA was acting as a relative constraint on particularly aggressive behavior by the Iranian regime against the United States. Instead, Iran responded to this maximum pressure campaign with a series of steps intended to put pressure on the United States, including targeting American facilities and assets directly and through proxies. But instead of carefully managing the escalation by responding with measured, necessary, proportionate actions intended to effectively push back on such aggressive behavior by Iran, to de-escalate and deter further attacks, the president seemingly stepped back and then decided to respond by engaging in a targeted killing of Iran's most powerful commander without the consent of our partners, the Iraqis, nor seemingly with any consultation of our NATO or coalition partners in Iraq. And as many have noted, Soleimani was an enemy of the United States who backed various operations against the United States and is responsible for the killing of Americans. But the question is not whether Soleimani deserved his fate. The question is whether this was a wise action that served U.S. national interests and ultimately made us safer. The administration has argued that the action was taken in self-defense to disrupt imminent attacks and was necessary to save lives. The comments of the Secretary of Defense this Sunday appear to contradict that assertion, and instead the action appears to have been taken largely to send a message to the Iranians and to potentially disrupt further unspecified attacks. Yet if that was the case, not only will our allies and partners view it as a violation of international law, But it is virtually impossible to understand why it was impractical for the President and his senior leadership to consult with Congress, our allies, and Iraq before targeting Soleimani in a military action that would be predictably be perceived by Iran as an effective declaration of war by the United States. Directly following the strike, we sent thousands of additional troops to the region to defend our people and our assets in light of an expected and ongoing Iranian response to the killing of Soleimani, thereby putting more Americans in harm's way. We have brought the fight against ISIL to a virtual standstill, with NATO suspending its training mission on the ground in Iraq and the possible ejection of our troops from the country. We have strengthened the Iranian-backed elements of the Iraqi government, weakened those who have supported the United States, and we've lost standing in the region. And Iran announced that it will move further away from the deal by restarting additional elements of its nuclear program, and the United States is more isolated than ever. And given where we are today, we desperately need to invest in diplomatic efforts, ideally with our allies to reduce existing tensions and identify a plausible path forward toward negotiations while promoting a more stable order that better serves security, human rights, and civic engagement, so as to provide hope of a way forward that does not inexorably lead, as we are now positioned, to a scenario in which the administration finds itself facing the choice the JCPOA was intended to avoid. That is the choice of either letting Iran obtain a nuclear weapon or bombing Iran, and thus launching what could easily become a full-scale regional war that the United States finds itself dragged into, having forgotten the lessons of our past. And let me just end by thanking all of you for your work on these issues and your efforts to advance the interests of Americans who rely on the government for their security and prosperity. I look forward to answering any questions you may have to the best of my ability.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haines. Mr. Hadley. Can you pull your microphone closer, please? Thank you.
I've lost my testimony skills. I apologize. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. To provide context for today's hearing, I would like, if I may, to describe briefly what appears to me to have been the underlying dynamic that led to the recent confrontation between the United States and Iran in Iraq. In the fall of last year, Iraqi citizens across their country demonstrated in massive numbers. They protested what they saw as the corruption, sectarianism, and ineffectiveness of their government. They protested the overweening influence that Iran exercises in Iraq, both directly and through Iranian-backed militias. At least 2 Iranian consulates in Iraq were attacked and burned. Demonstrations, even in the Shia South, called for Iran to leave Iraq, chanting, "Out, out, Iran." Beginning last October, Kataib Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed militia, began an escalating series of attacks on Iraqi military bases hosting U.S. forces. I believe Kataib Hezbollah would not have acted without the approval of Iranian authorities in general and Qasem Soleimani in particular. And I believe this military campaign was a cynical effort to change the conversation within Iraq and to shift attention from the issue of Iranian influence to the issue of the U.S. force presence, and ultimately to get U.S. forces thrown out of Iraq. The campaign escalated until a U.S. contractor was killed, at least 4 U.S. service personnel were wounded, and the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was attacked and partially burned. Some commentators will say that striking Qasem Soleimani, in doing so, the United States fell into Kataib Hezbollah's trap. But what was the alternative? The United States could not just stand by while its military and diplomatic personnel were attacked and killed. The U.S. administration clearly believed that striking Soleimani was so unexpected and so significant both militarily and politically that it would cause Iran to abandon its campaign against U.S. troops and diplomats in Iraq. We should all hope that it has that effect. The problem was that the strike occurred in Iraq. The fear of becoming the central battleground in a military confrontation between the United States and Iran is being used to justify calls for the expulsion of U.S. forces from Iraq. But a U.S. withdrawal would only reward Kataib Hezbollah's campaign of violence, strengthen the Iranian-backed militias, weaken the Iraqi government, undermine Iraqi sovereignty, and jeopardize the fight against ISIS, a terrible outcome for both the United States and Iraq. To keep U.S. forces in Iraq, Iraqi authorities will have to manage the domestic political fallout from the strike on Soleimani. The U.S. administration and the Congress can help by making public statements reaffirming that America respects the sovereignty and independence of Iraq, that U.S. forces are in Iraq to train Iraqi security forces and to help them protect the Iraqi people from a resurgent ISIS, that the United States will coordinate with the Iraqi government on matters involving the U.S. troop presence, that so long as U.S. troops and diplomats in Iraq are not threatened, America's confrontation with Iran will not be played out on Iraqi territory, and that the United States supports the aspirations of the Iraqi people for a government that can meet their needs and expectations and is free of corruption, sectarianism, and outside influence. After Iran's recent missile attacks in retaliation for the strike on Soleimani, both Iran and the United States appear to have stood down militarily. Despite some tough and uncompromising statements, both sides have said they want to avoid war and have left the door open for negotiations. Neither Iran nor the United States appears positioned or inclined to mount a diplomatic initiative, so that role must be played by third parties. The European countries that participated in the JCPOA nuclear deal, America's regional allies, and even Russian President Vladimir Putin are all potential candidates. Iran's current policy is going nowhere. New economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. administration could reignite the massive public demonstrations that Iran put down last fall only with brutal force. Iran's leaders in the past have been pragmatic when their hold on power was threatened. However, grudgingly, they may decide that negotiations are the least bad option. For its part, the U.S. administration still says that its goal is to begin negotiations to address Iran's nuclear, ballistic missile, and regional activities. Now may be the time to give diplomacy a chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hadley. This committee has received a lot of conflicting information about the killing of General Soleimani, but we have not received any evidence showing that this strike or any other strike was necessary to prevent an imminent attack. Never mind an attack on 4 U.S. embassies, as the President is now claiming. To make matters worse, Secretary of Defense Esper says he doesn't have any evidence of threats against our embassies either. So, Ms. Haines, let me ask you, as someone with significant experience on security matters like this, does it make sense to you that a military airstrike would be planned and carried out if the Secretary of Defense was unclear about why it was needed? Does it make any sense to you that if this strike was indeed necessary to save 4 embassies from attack, the administration officials would have left this out of their official justifications? And shouldn't we have heard about a variety of demonstrable steps at those embassies to prepare for an attack? So what do you make of these claims by the President? Ms. Haines.
Thank you, Chairman. I do think the number of conflicting comments being made by senior administration officials about whether or not there was, in fact, any threat and the degree of the threat that was being faced are really concerning. And I think all of you obviously have access to classified information that I don't have access to, and I can't tell you whether or not there's some story there that provides a basis for the action that was taken. But what's in the public realm does not add up to imminence as I have understood it and as I've applied it both as a lawyer and a policymaker within government. And I think it is particularly important when you take an action like this to be as transparent and frankly to have as consistent of a message coming out of the government about why it is that we felt it was absolutely necessary to take this action. And that's true not just from a legal matter, but really from a policy perspective, which is to say that our allies and partners are watching us and trying to understand why it is that we took this action, why we thought it was absolutely necessary. And so is, you know, as has been noted, I think repeatedly by all of us, so has Iraq, wondering why that is, and we would not have had the legal basis for taking an action against Soleimani in Iraq without their consent, without it being an imminent threat, and they want to know what that imminent threat is, and nothing that's been said really backs that up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, I won't mourn the loss of Qasem Soleimani. He was a bad guy. He had the blood of our military and thousands of Syrian civilians on his hands. He fueled the Yemeni civil war, and he imprisoned the people of Lebanon through Iran's support of Hezbollah. What concerned me about the escalation against Iran was how it seemed to overlook unintended but predictable consequences. Dr. Haass, you outlined several consequences in your testimony, from Iran's withdrawal from its constraints under the nuclear deal to a possible premature U.S. troop departure from Iraq. So let me ask you this. What should the Trump administration do to de-escalate regional tensions, and what could the administration do to help ease the tensions with Iran and move toward diplomacy?
Well, thank you, sir. I actually think there's something of an opportunity now for diplomacy. Steve Hadley ended his statement saying this was the time. I think the sanctions have had much more of an effect than people predicted. I've done several books on sanctions, and I underestimated, quite honestly, what unilateral sanctions in this regard could accomplish. I think also the Ukrainian air tragedy has built on already discontent within Iran, the sense that the government there is putting too much into guns and not enough into butter. Up to now, we haven't really given the Iranians a diplomatic option. Secretary Pompeo's May 2018 speech, to me, had all the features of an ambitious grand bargain. I took it as a non-starter. To me, it was tantamount to regime change or capitulation. What I think we ought to do, it could have been done conceivably if we had stayed in with the JCPOA, which would have been to try to get an extension of the so-called sunset provisions, but that's over for now. So I think we ought to go public, as I said, with a modified agreement. And we can decide whether the constraints on nuclear activity, centrifuges and enriched uranium are open-ended or for 3 decades, 4 decades, what have you. We can decide whether to bring missiles into it, which I would do. And I think we ought to talk about the degree of explicit sanctions relief that would accrue to Iran if they would sign up to that kind of an agreement. And I think we would find the allies would support us. Indeed, today's newspapers have stories about the allies being concerned about Iran's breakout from the JCPOA. So I think we would have significant multilateral backing there. And I think even the Russians and the Chinese would be attracted to something that would be diplomatic and change the momentum. So I think the time is right to put forward an initiative. And again, I think there is an interesting episode in Iranian history, which is the late 80s. And the then supreme leader accepted an outcome to the Iran-Iraq war that he said he would never accept. But he said, this is like poison to me. But the supreme leader accepted it because he thought it was essential at the time to save the 1979 revolution. And it's just possible that we are approaching a moment in Iranian history where these sanctions are having sufficient impact, where there might be a greater willingness on the part of the Iranian authorities to compromise, particularly with the pressure from below in the street. I could be wrong, I don't know, but I would test it. And I think we ought to put forward a diplomatic initiative, and I think that'll be clarifying. We'll learn a lot about this Iranian government and the current context about whether there's the possibility of a deal. If not, then we can deal with the consequences about how we deal with their nuclear, missile, and regional programs. But let's put out there a diplomatic initiative that might be accepted. If not, it will at least be clarifying.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCaul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really, since the maximum pressure campaign was launched, we've seen a more and more provocative Iran. And since last October, as Mr. Hadley talked about, mounting strikes, one against a U.S. drone. I remember being in the White House debating what the response should be. Many in the room believe that there should be a response, that that's all the Iranians would understand, that the surface-to-air missile site should be hit. And yet the president didn't do that. He stepped back, he showed great restraint, and decided not to respond. And he got some criticism for doing that. And then as months went on, strikes continued to mount, culminating in an attack on our embassy. And at some point, in the killing of American and 4 soldiers, and at some point, I believe a response is necessary when our embassy is attacked. And then the final tipping point, I believe, for the president to have to make this decision. And I agree, Mr. Chairman, it could be a little clearer, and I think we could declassify more of this to put it out in the open, with the American people, not jeopardizing assets on the ground. But Soleimani's traveling to Damascus and Lebanon, and he's ending up in Baghdad meeting with his number 2 guy. Remember, the red line is an American being killed, says the president. So Soleimani, he's seeing this. He's meeting in Baghdad. Then he's going to fly to Tehran and meet with the Ayatollah, in my judgment, to get the green light to start the operation. Some say days, some say weeks. Regardless of the timing, the president done nothing, and this whole scenario had played out where hundreds of Americans and diplomats are killed in our embassy and at our bases, and possibly another 1979 where diplomats are taken hostage. Then what? So, Mr. Hadley, can you answer the question of the significance of the strike on Soleimani and whether that provides any deterrence to the Iranians?
I think that's the administration's hope. I think the run-up is very much as you described it. I don't know what imminent means in many contexts, but it seems to me we were in the middle of a pattern of escalating attack on American personnel, diplomatic and military, and it sounds imminent enough to me to justify a strike. I think the purpose of the strike was, as you described, to try to deter the Iranians from continuing up this escalatory ladder that was going to put more men and women, American men and women, and Iraqis at risk. That's what they tried to do. I think the statements that Secretary Pompeo then made thereafter, that if there was escalation by the Iranians, even targets in Iran were not off the table, was again an effort to try to reestablish deterrence, prevent this from escalating to war, and open the door for a negotiating track, which the administration has said for some time they're open to. And that's what I think one of the things that joins all 3 witnesses here is that's what we hope is the next step here. We think there is an opportunity, and we ought to try to take advantage of it.
And thank you. That was my next question. I do think all 3 of you agree with the pivot, if you will. Now, we saw a response from Iran. It was a face-saving measure, in my judgment. No casualties, thank God. And then everybody took a step back, and it de-escalated. That's the good news. I do see this as a window of opportunity now to exercise diplomacy, and he talked about NATO as well. Maybe for the 3 of you, very shortly with my time, what would this diplomacy look like moving forward?
I think primarily it is actually putting forward what it is that the administration would be interested in reaching a deal on. I think that's a critical aspect of the next step of diplomacy, because right now I think what has been described is really a non-starter. I don't think, I suspect none of us would disagree on that point with the Iranians, and I think one of the challenges that's going to that the administration will face at this point is actually getting the Iranians to the point of being willing to engage in discussions in light of what they've put on the table as such a non-starter. So I think there's got to be a process that you need to start to pull them in, essentially, into in order to do this. Thank you. Can I also respond to your earlier point? I mean, I don't think that anybody thinks that we shouldn't have responded at all to Iran. I think that the real concern is the way that this response was done. In other words, the weight. In some respects, the stepping back encouraged them to do more instead of having a response that was done early on. And then when there was a response, it was so escalatory that I think it created a situation that makes it more challenging to go down this road now than it was before.
Well, I think the chairman and I do agree the world's safer without this man. He was a mastermind of terror. He killed a lot of Americans and wounded soldiers like Mr. Mast in front of me. who doesn't have his legs anymore, and so I don't have a lot of sympathy for the man. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Pompeo's absence today is the loudest testimony. It speaks volumes. It shows that the Secretary of State cannot defend the decision-making process that led us to this point. Cannot defend a process in which apparently the President did not hear from experts on what effect this would have on politics in Iraq. Apparently the President did not focus, as Dr. Haass pointed out, the importance of the Iranian street and the willingness of the Iranian people to endure these sanctions rather than to demand that their government change or that they change their government. Apparently, the President heard from no experts on the politics of Europe or the economics or politics of Iran or Iraq. And apparently, the President did not hear from any experts in Shiite Islam about what the effect would be of creating a martyr in front of a people whose religion's foundational event was the martyrdom of Imam Hussein 1,300 years ago. The Secretary of State cannot defend a process in which Lindsey Graham is given advance notice on a golf course, but the group of 8 congressional leaders, a group that has never leaked, is not given advance notice. He cannot defend a process where a disdainful tweet is treated by the President as official notice that he may take future military action. He cannot defend a process in which Congress is not told in classified briefing that 4 embassies were targeted, but he's free to tell a rally in Toledo. The only defense there might be he might have been lying in Toledo. So the Secretary's failure to come here speaks quite loudly about a presidential decision-making process that was shallow, simplistic, and disdainful. The effect of this attack was to undermine our support in Iraq, and it was to strengthen the regime in Iran and allow it to continue its policies notwithstanding our sanctions. But then an intervening and unpredicted event occurred. We helped the regime by creating 1 martyr. The regime just created 176 martyrs. Ukraine Air 752 was shot down, and now the regime has arrested a few people, we don't know whom, or at least I don't know whom. They will try to focus on some enlisted man who pushed a button with only 10 seconds to make a decision. What they will try not to focus on is the ministerial level decision not to ground or even alter civilian air traffic, knowing that they had put their air defense system on hair trigger alert. And what they know they won't focus on is the decision by the top regime officials to lie to the Iranian people when they knew the truth. I'll ask any witness, but particularly Mr. Hadley, and I know we were talking about this earlier, a more authoritarian regime might have lied to its people longer. But I think it's clear to the world that the plan they had was to lie, and then there was just too much evidence in the hands of Ukrainians and others. Who could the decision to lie to the Iranian people and keep lying as more and more evidence got to the top leadership, could that have been made by anyone other than at the highest levels of the Iranian government?
I don't think we know how this sorted out. Clearly, the IRGC, which is a very powerful force in the Iranian administration, in the Iranian government, was going to take the fall for this because it was their forces that essentially shot down the airplane. And unfortunately, it's a very natural human reaction to sort of lie and deny when you've been caught in a bad action. And I think that was their reaction. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch.
But
what this does.
would not the Supreme Leader have known within 24 hours of the downing of the plane that, in fact, Iranian forces had brought it down?
I don't know. I can't answer that question.
And does anyone here know who the Iranians have arrested so far, or at what level or rank? I believe my time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, according to ABC News, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, and I quote, December 27th attack on the Iraqi base near Kirkuk that killed a U.S. civilian contractor and wounded several U.S. and Iraqi forces was designed and intended to kill, and Soleimani approved it. I know that 100%, he said. He also said, as my colleague, the ranking member said a moment ago, that not to have acted would have been culpably negligent. Former Obama Homeland Security Jay Johnson said that Soleimani was a lawful military objective. And of course, Mr. Hadley, today you said the U.S. could not just stand by while its military and diplomatic personnel were attacked and killed. Mr. Chairman, Soleimani, and let's not forget this, is directly responsible for killing over 600 Americans and disabling thousands more. He's directly responsible for massive death and injury of innocent civilians in the region. He was a mass murderer. In the last 2 months alone, he orchestrated 11 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, killing an American contractor, as we know. Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Haass, one of your colleagues, said that according to the Council on Foreign Relations, no president, we're talking about President Obama, used drone strikes more than President Obama, who ordered 542 drone strikes, killing an estimated 3,797 people, including 324 civilians. Yes, they weren't as high a target. They weren't of a mass murder of the caliber and of the degrading influence that Soleimani has had, both in the region and in his own country. You know, the 1,500 people that were killed protesting, demanding democracy, demanding a change, they showed them no mercy. He showed them no mercy. Let me just ask a question, if I could, with regards to the money that was gleaned by Iran as a result of the Iranian, American, and European nuclear arms deal. I had asked Secretary Liu back in July of 2015, how much are we really talking about? The BBC recently said it was $100 billion with a B. The New York Times suggested $100 billion. He said it was $115 billion theoretically, but probably closer to $58 to $59 billion. I don't know what it is. You know, we don't have a clear sense of that, but that's a lot of money if that's how much it was. So my question is, how much money did Iran actually get? How much of that was deployed to fund terrorism, including the procurement of weapons, to pay the IRGC troops, the Quds Force, which has massively expanded their operations? Did Soleimani and other terrorists personally benefit when all of that money was sent in crates on pallets, $1.7 billion, smaller bills? Who got that money? Where did it go? I've asked that question. Many of my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, have asked that question. Did it fund terrorism? When he answered the question, again, this is Secretary Liu, he said, and I quote, "We can't say there won't be any more money going to malign purposes." Secretary Kerry has said similar things. How much? I mean, to give such massive amounts of money to mass murderers, terrorists, is unconscionable in my view. So how much? Can anybody speak to that with any kind of clarity?
Okay, great. So this idea that billions of dollars, that came out of the deal were then used to launch ballistic missiles or to, fund IRGC, et cetera, it's patently untrue.
None of that money has been used for that?
No, let me finish my answer and I'll give you the thing. In return for a permanent and verifiable halt to Iran's nuclear program, right, the United States, along with our P5+1 partners, provided relief of nuclear-related sanctions to Iran. But even senior Trump administration officials have conceded that the vast majority of Iran's unfrozen funds, so funds that were theirs, that we had frozen, that then they were able to access, went to domestic requirements, right, including debt servicing. And what's more, even at the height of international sanctions, Tehran amply funded the IRGC and its proxies. So it's certainly not the case that Iran needed unfrozen funds in order to sustain their activities. Far from it. The IRGC has a relatively small budget, and making its activities sustainable through sanctions, the IRGC built Hezbollah. In fact, during the Iran-Iraq war.
Let me ask you this. How much of the money was diverted to the procurement of weapons from Russia, for example? Surface-to-air missiles. Do we know?
I don't know.
You don't know?
sir,
Okay. Does anybody in the panel
But
know?
the point is that they could conduct these activities without that issue.
More money means you can do more of it.
Can I say two things?
Yeah.
One is obviously money is fungible. So if you get money, it can be used for whatever purpose you want. I think it is important, to say that a lot of the funds you're talking about, all of them were Iranian. I'd like to actually focus on the first thing you said. I actually think you've opened up what is something that hasn't been talked about in the narrow debate about imminence. If imminence wasn't met, or as the president tweeted, if imminence doesn't matter, then the only rationale for what the United States did was either prevention, which is an open-ended thing. We don't want certain things to happen whenever they might, or it's retaliation for what Soleimani had done in the past. If we are talking about justifying American military, the use of military force for either prevention or for retaliation, that is something, that is basically called war. That is why we fight wars. We want to prevent things or we want to retaliate. Again, imminence is preemption. Under international law, under the UN Charter, that gives you the right of anticipatory self-defense. It's a special category. It's when you hit a missile just when it's about to be launched. You get an airplane when it's about to take off. But to do either retaliation prevention is a big step. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's a big step. It would be the kind of thing we would do against Iran conceivably. If all of our arms control efforts failed, Iran was developing a nuclear weapons program, and we said we have to stop it. It's the kind of thing that Israel did against both Iraq and Syria. Those were preventive strikes. It's a big step we have to think about. All I'm saying, and I think for Congress and for this committee, as I understand the AUMFs and all that, we do not have at the moment authority to carry out preventive or retaliatory
Then on that
steps.
point, and I know my time is over, but Jay Johnson said that Soleimani was a lawful military objective. You don't agree?
I do not agree because he is.
He was in Baghdad.
He was an agent. He's an agent of a state, of a country. If he were if he were simply working for a terrorist organization, then we have all the authorities we want. But as an official of the Iranian government, who's using terrorist-like tactics,
He was designated a terrorist under the Obama administration.
And I have questions about the validity. I think that we have to be careful. He is an agent of a state. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. All I'm saying is it's a big step, and we should think about, we may want to do it, we may not want to do it. But the idea of using military force for preventive or retaliatory reasons against officials of the Iranian government or against Iran directly is a big step for the United States. And I think it's something that this committee and the Congress more broadly ought to contemplate the pros and cons of doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Haass. Let me say before I call on Mr. Meeks that it really is false to compare the legality of strikes against al-Qaeda, including against Osama bin Laden, with the killing of Iranian officials, because Congress specifically authorized strikes against al-Qaeda after 9/11. We've never authorized strikes against Iran, and to say otherwise is just not factually correct. Let me call on Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Haass, because that's exactly where I was going to start my thoughts, because clearly the administration initially thought that they did not have the authority to do the strike other than utilizing the fact that there was an imminent threat. If they thought they had other avenues of which to justify, they would not have said, as they did over the first couple of days, that they did it because there was an imminent threat. And the president then saying that there were 4 embassies, or he thought 4 embassies were going to be threatened. And so For me, when you talk about the assassination of General Soleimani, it was not to stop an imminent Iranian attack against the United States. Nothing that I have seen in classified settings or otherwise has shown me one shred of support for the president's initial claim that there were such a threat. Given conflicting explanations coming out of the administration about the killing of Soleimani, it is particularly striking to me, first of all, that Secretary Pompeo is not here today to speak directly to this committee. Over and over again, we see from the Trump administration a clear disregard for congressional oversight responsibilities as an equal branch of government. And with this escalation of hostilities in the Middle East, we see other consistent patterns. There's no strategy, there's conflicting stories, and there's even downright lies. I have disagreed with actions of previous administrations when it came to acts of military aggression that set us on the course for war. But I have to say this, at least they showed up for those actions and to produce a case. This administration does not even have the guts to make the case for what it did, whether it was preemptive, preventive, defensive, or simply retaliation. Congress must have the facts surrounding this assassination. Our men and women in uniform deserve the facts. The American people deserve the facts. Congress demands those facts in the face of impulsive actions by the President of the United States. President Trump may have infatuation for, as we've seen during his course of office, for dictators and authoritarian governments, but we have neither of those in the United States of America. And Congress and the American people must get answers. The list of actions that are legally and strategically questionable continue to pile up in this administration, and yet they still refuse to provide clear and honest answers. Pulling out of the JCPOA, no strategy. Abandoning the Kurds, no strategy. Specific benefit of assassinating Soleimani, no strategy. Suggesting that the U.S. would destroy cultural sites in Iran, no strategy. Denying Iran's foreign minister Zarif a visa to go to the UN, no strategy. Suggesting that we will punish Iraq if it follows through on expelling our military, no strategy. We need answers. Were the U.S. embassies in jeopardy of attack or not? What do the American people need to know about talks with Iran facilitated by Switzerland? What happened in Yemen? And what happens now that we have, by this strike, diverted the attention away from the fight against ISIS? Reports indicate acknowledgement of our allies that the focus has shifted, at least for now. So, Dr. Haass, and then I hear the President is now saying that that NATO should be more involved, whether or not there was questions or whether or not he informed any of our NATO allies before this strike, what he was going to do or why he was going to do it, et cetera. We don't know, but going to our allies after the fact seems to me to be questionable also. So, but I would like to know from your estimation, sir, what specific role could and should NATO play with respect to the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, given the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA, and what parameters are necessary before the alliance considers additional operations in the region so that we are working collectively together as one?
Well, thank you, sir. As a first step, it's not NATO, but it would involve several of the European members of NATO, I would think, to consult about the JCPOA, what I call 2.0, some future initiative, and to also consult about how we would respond in terms of sanctions to gradual Iranian breakout of the 2015 agreement. That ought to be a U.S.-European undertaking. I also think we ought to be consulting with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others about how we deal with the possibility that Iran will directly or indirectly undertake other military actions around the region. I do not want to see a repeat, for example, of the sort of thing we saw when the Saudi oil installations were attacked and we didn't respond. I think that erodes deterrence. In terms of NATO more formally, this is an obvious out-of-area mission, and the question is whether it's protecting oil traffic. One can imagine some joint efforts to protect certain countries in the region. I think, again, it would be a big out-of-area undertaking for NATO, but there's no reason we ought to do this unilaterally. And I think we have a much better chance of getting NATO to do something like this if it were done in a larger context of being coupled with the diplomatic initiative.
Thank you. Out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Chabot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many in the mainstream media and many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, not all, but many, have been very critical of the President's action in taking out Soleimani and said it's irresponsible and warlike and he wants to start another war. I would argue, as a ranking member said a little while ago, that I think this President's responses to Iranian aggression has been very restrained, whether it was shooting down our drone or attacks on international shipping or their overall general aggression in the region. This President has not taken significant military action. Even in this case, it was very targeted. It was decisive. It was justified. I would argue long overdue when one considers how much blood, American blood and others, that this monster had on his hands. So it's good he's dead, and it's good there wasn't significant collateral damage. And I think this President showed great responsibility, and I think we should be proud of the action he took. With that said, there are ongoing protests now, and accelerated protests, really, because of the airliner being shot down by the Iranians. And the previous administration, of course, got some criticism when, during the Green Movement, when the people were protesting and they were put down most viciously and aggressively by the Iranian government at the time, and that there should have been a more significant American response. Of course, the argument against it is then the government uses that against the people that are protesting and says, oh, you're in cahoots with the Americans or whatever. So there's an argument on both sides. But the protesting is ongoing now, and I think all of us, certainly most of us, would like to support that. But I'd be interested, since we really have a very distinguished panel of experts here, as to what is the best way for us and our allies, the free world, to support these protesters. Because as the President has said, his beef is with the mullahs and this government which represses the Iranian people, not the Iranian people. We're on their side of the people. So what can we do to assist them? And I'll just go to Mr. Hadley, and we'll just go down the line.
It's a very good question. It's tricky because one of the things authoritarian regimes do when there are demonstrations against them is to blame it on outside powers.
Right.
And so anything we will say will be used as evidence that, aha, the Americans are behind these demonstrations, and to try to discredit them. That being said, I think the administration is right, and prior administrations have tried to make it clear that we are on the side of the Iranian people, for a government that is more accountable, a government that is paying attention to their needs, that provides better prosperity, security, and a brighter future for them. We ought to be very clear about that. And at the same time, disparaging them by saying, the government, by saying instead of operations in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, the Iranian government ought to be taking care of the people at home. We ought to make that very clear. And the third thing we ought to make clear is that, and I think we can, and hopefully get other countries to join us in this, there is no justification for a government to use lethal force against peaceful demonstrators. That's a general principle we all should subscribe with, and hopefully that will deter the Iranian authorities from further crackdown on their own people as they demonstrate against the incompetence of their own government.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Haines?
Thank you. I fully agree with what Mr. Hadley has said, and would say on that last point, too, that I think one of the things that the administration could usefully be doing now is working with other partners and allies to reinforce that message in order to create the deterrence on that point. I think another thing, honestly, that I believe the administration could do to support the Iranian people is to lift the ban on visas. essentially. So allowing common Iranians to come into the United States actually is critical for us in developing those relationships and in promoting and understanding better the Iranian people and giving them a voice on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Haass?
Agree with all the statements by my two colleagues here. I would think that, again, we should, with an initiative that specifically promised sanctions relief that would help the Iranian people, if only their government would change its ways. It needs to be in public, and I think that would help. I also believe it would help if we were consistent. It looks too opportunistic for the United States to simply single out repression in Iran. Last I checked, it's going on in a lot of other countries around the world. There's been a democratic recession over the last decade and a half. And it would look as though, if we stand up for the Iranian people, and it's part of a consistent policy, it will be taken much more that this is not regime change by another name. It'll look, so if we stand up and we're critical of what the Chinese are doing, what Russia's doing, what's happening in the Philippines, what's happened in Saudi Arabia. We can go around the world. Unfortunately, there's too many places these days. But if we stand up and we make it clear that this is part of a larger policy, that we stand for for rights everywhere, I think that actually will be much better received within Iran.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the esteemed experts being here today, but it is, Mr. Chairman, shameful that the Secretary of State is not sitting before us to answer the questions of the American people. This administration may disregard Congress as a co-equal branch of government, and they may ignore congressional authority to authorize the use of military force, but I would remind the Secretary that we are the elected representatives of the American people. The President is giving more information to Fox News than to members of Congress, but with each new piece of information, the story gets more and more confusing. Conflicting explanations from the White House, the State Department, and the Defense Department should give all Americans pause. Not pause as to whether or not Soleimani was a bad man who deserved his fate. Of course he was, and he did, but pause to question whether this action makes us safer today and in the long run, and to question whether we can believe what the President says in the context of our national security. It is beyond offensive that some, including the President of the United States, suggest that by asking for verification of intelligence after a significant military escalation, and somehow members of Congress who swore an oath to this country are defending a man responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. We have a solemn duty to know that if we are sending American men and women into harm's way, we are doing so because it is the only way to preserve our national security. It is our most solemn duty as elected representatives, and I cannot understand why anyone is surprised that we might want to ask some questions when such an abrupt and escalatory action is taken. Now, my record on this committee going after Iran's malign activities and their support of terrorism worldwide speaks for itself, as does the chairman's and many others who have spent a decade working to prevent the Iranian regime from obtaining a nuclear weapon, spreading terrorism, and destabilizing an entire region, and violating the human rights of its own people. And our colleagues on the other side of the aisle understand that they know that, and I am sure that none of them would today suggest that any of us here is on the side of terrorists. Every one of us today is committed to strengthening our national security. Members of Congress know that, the White House knows it, and they ought to act accordingly, in word, in action, and on Twitter. Dr. Haass, as you've said, we are where we are now. Soleimani is dead. The House has spoken on the President's authority to start war with Iran. And his death doesn't change the fact that Iran still has ballistic missiles. It still supplies proxy groups with dangerous weapons. It still could easily restart its march to a nuclear weapon, still cracks down on protesters and violates the human rights of its own people. Let's not forget that in October, the ban on conventional weapons sales to Iran is going to expire. So in this current reality, in the absence of any real international coalition or negotiations, what immediate steps can be taken to address these threats, and what do we make of the Europeans' decision to trigger the dispute mechanism in the JCPOA to hold Iran accountable to its commitments. Does that present an opening to rebuilding this coalition?
Well, the news about the Europeans, sir, is very good news. It suggests to me that we are not alone here. Concern about Iran's behavior, nuclear, missile, and regional is widespread. The JCPOA was a collective effort, and it's not too late, I think, to revive multilateralism here. That's really serious. I mean, all of us have worked with the Europeans on this issue, and they were not dragged along kicking and screaming. They were, in many cases, ahead of us. So I think we've got real partners there on dealing with Iran, and I think there would be tremendous support for some type of an initiative that built on the JCPOA and extended some of the constraints on Iran, again, in exchange for a degree of sanctions relief. I actually think there'd be a lot of openness to that idea. I think what we were just talking about a minute ago, there's tremendous concern about human rights and political situation in Iran. So I think we'll find that we're knocking on an open door there in some type of a collective effort. So I would work on that front. The other thing I think you heard from all three of us is the importance of repairing the U.S.-Iraqi relationship. I mean, think about it. Qasem Soleimani's principal goal was to drive the United States out of Iraq. Why in the world would we want to facilitate his success there after his death? We ought to make sure that doesn't happen. And Steve Hadley gave, I thought, a lot of good ideas about ways we could signal, almost to help the Iraqi government manage the Iraqi politics. We could also look at some creative things. When I was in the Pentagon years ago, when we were building what became Central Command, we used to look at the idea of presence without stationing. There's ways to have a regular force presence without necessarily having forces be permanent. This may help the Iraqi government manage the politics of it without a serious diminution of our capabilities. So it may be impossible to go back exactly where we were with Iraq, but it has got to be a strategic priority of the United States not to allow Iran to really how do I put it bluntly, to Finlandize Iraq. We ought not to let that happen. It need not happen. And we don't want to see groups like ISIS start up again, basically resume their business. We made so much progress in Iraq. Whatever you thought of the 2003 war, we made a lot of progress there. To throw it away over this seems to me really self-defeating and counterproductive. It's not too late, but we need to get on it.
Thanks, Dr. Haass. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, universally respected Senator Joe Lieberman, a Democrat, provided an extraordinary op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I quote, "President Trump's order to take out Soleimani was morally, constitutionally, and strategically correct. No American can dispute that Soleimani created, supported, and directed a network of terrorist organizations that spread havoc in the Middle East. In Syria, more than 500,000 Syrians have died. During the Iraq War, Soleimani oversaw 3 camps in Iran. They trained fighters who have killed more than 600 American troops. The claim that President Trump had no authority to order this attack without constitutional approval is constitutionally untenable and practically senseless. Authority to act quickly to eliminate a threat to the U.S. is inherent. Democrats should leave partisan politics at the water's edge and stand together against Iran and dangerous leaders like Soleimani." End of quote. And Senator Joe Lieberman, I'm really grateful. He tells the truth. And Mr. Hadley, I'm particularly grateful that you actually cited the murder of Nawaz Hamid. Mr. Hamid was an Iraqi-American contractor of Muslim faith. He was killed December 27th, just 2 weeks ago, a Californian killed by the missile attacks of the militias directed by Soleimani. Keeping that in mind, I see positive coming. And Mr. Hadley, it's encouraging to me to see that our appreciated European allies are changing their policies on sanctioning of Iranian authoritarians. What progress do you see in that regard?
It is interesting, as you point out, that the Europeans, that is to say France, Germany, and the UK, indicated that they were going to go to the United Nations to raise the issue of Iranian noncompliance and potentially start a process that would involve the springing back of the sanctions that were relieved as part of the JCPOA nuclear deal. How far that will go, we don't know. You know, the Europeans are trying, without joining the administration's policy of maximum pressure, are nonetheless trying to preserve that nuclear agreement and to try to keep Iran abiding by its terms. And I think one of the dramas that this committee will want to keep an eye on going forward is if Iran does continue its gradual progression to no longer observe the limits of that agreement, and the time between now and when it can get the nuclear material necessary to make a nuclear weapon reduces from a year to months and maybe weeks, there will be calls for a military action by the United States. There will be calls, I think, within Israel. And it is one of the issues, I think, that this committee needs to think about in advance. You're entitled to information about past actions. I think the committee has an opportunity to do some deliberations about what is the framework that should be in place in the event that Iran moves in that direction.
I appreciate raising the threats to Israel. We know that it's Iran that has placed tens of thousands of rockets with Hezbollah in Lebanon to challenge and threaten the people of Israel. They've placed tens of thousands of rockets in Gaza with Hamas to threaten the people of Israel. What role would Soleimani have played in supporting these terrorist organizations?
Soleimani was a government official in the government of Iran, that is true. He was also the mastermind of these terrorist militias that Iran supported. And he was behind the creation of Hezbollah, which was one of his great, he would say, one of his great creations. A presence in southern Lebanon that poses a real danger to Lebanon, to Israel. So he was more than a government official. He was really the mastermind of one of the most successful terrorist operations there has ever been. And I think there's very little question that as a matter of defense, he got his just desserts.
And it's inconceivable to me to hear that there should be an immunity for persons because they are a leader of the world's #1 sponsor of terrorism. They should be a target. The president acted correctly, protecting American families and Israeli families immediately, but Muslims first. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel. And Dr. Haass, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for your wonderful work on the council. I must say, my good friend from what's that?
Thank you for your dues.
Yeah, make sure I'm current with it. My good friend from South Carolina, if we follow his logic, apparently we're going to be assassinating lots of bad people all over the world, because apparently that's all we need. If they're bad people and they're responsible or can be tied to the deaths of Americans or allied citizens, it's Wild West. We go out and kill them. And by the way, without a howdy-do from Congress and without any kind of real coherent rationalization to Congress or to the American people, and the consequences be damned. Let's not even talk about the consequences. Sometimes somebody can be a bad actor that in an ideal world we might want to take out, but we got to look at the consequences of doing so, none of which happened in this case, and that's why we're having this hearing. And I understand that in wanting to justify or defend the president's actions, we might get carried away a little bit, but I don't know, Dr. Haass, if you want to comment, but I'm one of these people who looks at the fact that Article 1 in the Constitution is about the powers of Congress, and it's Article 1, not Article 8, for a reason. The writers of the Constitution, our founders, felt that the ultimate power of war and peace was in Congress's hands, not the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief follows only after Congress acts on the matters of war and peace. Now, in the modern world, we've abrogated that power time and time again because we like having it both ways. That doesn't mean that the president gets to have unfettered power to make these kinds of decisions without consultation with Congress. Is that a fair statement, do you think, Dr. Haass?
Yeah, let me, I won't use your words, but I'm close to it. I think there's a fundamental difference between taking out a member of a terrorist organization and taking out an individual who's an official of a nation state who happens to use terrorist organizations to promote what the state sees as its agenda. I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. I'm saying it's a big step. We've crossed a line here. So I think one thing this committee needs to think about is when it looks at AUMFs, none is on the books that allows us to do this, as best I understand. So I think it's a legitimate question for this committee to say, do we need to think about an AUMF towards Iran that deals with this set of scenarios where Iran would use military force to promote its ends, and also with the one that both Steve Hadley and I have talked about here, about the gathering threat on the Iranian nuclear side. Just say we do get intelligence that Iran is a week or month away.
Yes, let me just interrupt you there. I listened to Dr. Hadley with great interest, and I don't think his analysis is wrong about after the fact. But what Dr. Hadley, at least in this set of remarks, did not mention was, well, who ripped up the JCPOA? It wasn't Iran. It was President Donald J. Trump. And that did not make the world safer. It made it more dangerous. It meant we lost all leverage over Iran other than sanctions, and they had nothing left to lose. How can we be surprised that they are now deciding, based on the economic pain they're experiencing because we reimpose sanctions, that they're going to use the one big lever they've got, namely the nuclear development program, which is exactly the outcome I thought we and the Israeli government wanted to avoid.
Well, I don't think we can be surprised. As I said in my statement, we practiced economic warfare. They can't respond symmetrically, so they respond asymmetrically with the only kind of warfare they provide. Again, coming back to this committee, I don't think war powers is something that solves this question. I do think the front door of AUMFs, for whatever range of scenarios we're thinking about Iran, is a subject worthy of your collective
So,
consideration.
Dr. Haass, final question, because I'm going to run out of time. The assertion's been made here multiple times that the world is a safer place without Soleimani in it. What about the other side of that coin, though? What about the fact that actually by assassinating Soleimani, perhaps unwittingly, we've made the world actually a more dangerous place, not only for Americans, but for the region?
Again, as I said, no one mourns his departure, but the question of whether we are safer, I myself have concluded that we are not, that this was not a wise course of action, and I thought there were better ways to restore deterrence, as that was one of our goals, rather than opening up the kind of scenario I fear we may have opened up here.
And just in terms of timing, and then I'll end, Mr. Chairman, while we're claiming it's a safer world, with Soleimani not in it, we evacuated Iraq for all Americans. We gave a direction to all American civilians in Iraq to leave the country. Is that correct?
I don't know the details of the State Department warning, sir, so I just don't know the explicit nature of who was advised to...
Right after it happened, the State Department urged all Americans, civilians, to leave Iraq immediately, whether by air or by land, and put Americans in the region on high alert. So much for a safer world. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Anybody on the panel believe that Iran is seeking a peaceful nuclear program for which to generate power, medical devices, et cetera? Anybody on the panel believe that? Hello?
I'll just speak, if you want a verbal answer, my short answer is no. I think they want to keep the option of having a military program very much alive.
Any reason to have a heavy water reactor and enrich plutonium if you're going to have a civilian nuclear program? Any reason at all? Yes, ma'am?
Go ahead. You want to go ahead?
I'll just do, I mean, I have the same view that Dr. Haass presented. I think the question is there a difference between what you're describing, in other words, a peaceful program, which nobody thinks that Iran is really doing this simply for peaceful reasons or for medical isotopes or things along those lines, versus a decision to actually pursue a nuclear weapon, which is the space that we're in right now and that we've been trying to manage, in effect.
Mr. Hatt.
We know from intelligence that up until 2003, Iran had a covert nuclear weapon program and a covert military run enrichment capability to feed that program, and that they gave it up in 2003 when, after the U.S. invasion in Iraq, they thought they were next. And it raises this point that Iran has responded to threats to the regime to change its policy. I think that's what you saw when they gave up their nuclear, formal nuclear weapon program in 2003. And I think they have continued an infrastructure that gives them the option. And they have kept that alive.
Do any of you know what is happening regarding their nuclear program in the military installations and sites that are not inspected by any outside or international agency? None of you know. They could be ready right now for as much as you know, right? They could be ready right now. You can't say they're not, right? We don't think they are, but you can't say they're not. My point is that they're doing this, and they're going to do this, and over the course of much of my lifetime, we've sat back and watched them do this and hoped they would stop, right? I don't know if any of you have read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Warning to the West, but we don't like confrontation. We hope that it will just be copacetic if we talk to them and be nice. But they won't be nice. They're not going to be. They have no plans to be. And we're fools to believe anything other than that. I know my good friend from Virginia said that, well, I guess it's a new thing for America to go around killing people, that terrorists and so on and so forth, that we disagree with or don't like. I know he's not here, but I'm fascinated by the fact that there were 526 separate counterterrorism strikes under the last administration. You know what we heard in this committee about that? About the hue and cry. Article 1, Article 2, the presidential powers. Who does he think he is? You know what we heard? We heard nothing. We were killing terrorists, and thank God we were killing terrorists. People in this body, people in this building, people in this town send people to war knowing this guy's walking around conducting strikes on Americans, conducting strikes all around the world, killing people, innocent people, combatants, Americans, etc., and did nothing. Did nothing. The people in this building, the people in this town should be ashamed of themselves. They should be, it's despicable. It's unthinkable to me that this president finally did it. Is a ray of sunshine for the world. This guy's a murdering terrorist and should have been taken out. And what about the consequences? Everybody's saying, well, we're escalating. Do you folks know that in the last 2 months, 24 separate attacks on America or America's interests in November, December of 2019? Wake up, everybody. What would it take? How many more lives? Americans had to leave Iraq because Soleimani was killed. Oh, well, I guess you can stay and take your chances. You can do that. This is absurd. This hearing is absurd. This subject is absurd. And quite honestly, the comments from many of the people in this place have never put on the boots, carried the weapon, and defended their country are absurd. We have put people's lives at risk knowing full well that they shouldn't be there because we didn't give a damn to do the right thing to protect them. I yield back.
Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to focus my questions actually on our relationship with Iraq. And wanting, Mr. Haass, Dr. Haass, you did begin to respond to that, and I wanted to ask the other witnesses if they would as well. Given what has happened, what is our current state of our relationship with Iraq?
Sure. I mean, I can only respond, obviously, based on the information that I see in the news. And it clearly the strike had an enormous impact on our relationship with Iraq. Iraq has come out and indicated that they did not provide consent for this particular strike on their territory. And it has brought the parliament to the point where they've actually passed a vote calling for the U.S. forces to leave. And we've seen that the Prime Minister has indicated that, in fact, they want a delegation to talk about leaving Iraq. And I think, you know, as Dr. Haass noted, this is, in many respects, exactly what Soleimani had wanted. And as a consequence, we're now in a position where I think it will be likely that it is unsustainable for us to have the presence that we've had. I hope that's not true. I hope that we can, in fact, get through this period with them and that their domestic politics don't erupt in such a way that it makes it impossible for us to stay.
And I would like to ask your thoughts, you know, Mr. Hadley, on what it would mean if we left. You know, when I saw the protest and the attack on our embassy, I was really shocked. I have been there, been to the Green Zone. As a matter of fact, I went with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Shabbat, and knowing how fortified that area was, to see it penetrated the way it was, it certainly left me feeling like the Iraqi military just basically said, have at it. I mean, I don't see how that could have happened without it. And so why did they do that? And what are the implications if our troops were forced out?
As I tried to indicate in my testimony, I think it would be a disaster for Iraq, a disaster for the United States, for the Iraqis. It would undermine their sovereignty, compromise their ability to deal with ISIS, and open the door to even more Iranian influence. I'm not pessimistic about this. I think it's a political problem for the government. In that parliamentary vote, as I understand it, all the Sunni and Kurdish representatives stayed away, clearly do not want to see U.S. forces pulled out. There are demonstrations returning in Iraq today, Shia on the street, and they are now focused once again on Iranian influence. So I think if we can buy some time, if we can make the kind of statements that will help Prime Minister Al-Mahdi deal with the problem politically, the domestic political problem he has, and start a process of consultation, we can talk about what is the proper mission, configuration, and role of U.S. forces now that ISIS has been forced out and yet is also organizing to return. I think we can change the mission configuration of the forces, make sure we're partnering closely with the Iraqis, and keep a significant force there. I think it's in the interest of the United States and the interest of Iraq.
So, Dr. Haass, thinking about ISIS, I'm thinking about what happened in Iraq, and then also Syria, and the fact that we pulled out of Syria, and I don't know the status of the ISIS soldiers that were imprisoned and given Iraq and Syria. What are your thoughts about a resurgence of ISIS?
Well, I think it's highly likely that there will be a resurgence. Turkey is not, whatever else Turkey is, it is not a full partner in this effort. It's not a priority in some cases for the government. Also, a lot of these people in Syria, unlike Iraq, came from around the world. Iraqis were, in many cases, much more local. So I assume to some extent that there's a real danger of reconstitution. Will it go back to the way it was? Hopefully not. You know, a lot of things have to happen.
Or what about some of those soldiers going back to Europe?
Oh, again, I think that in large part depends upon Turkey's behavior. Turkey has often used the flows in both directions as a source of leverage. You know that, both recruits coming to the region and people coming back. But you have to assume that a certain number will get back to Europe. This is, I think, a permanent challenge, to put it bluntly, for European security. I don't see it ever disappearing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I just want to bring us back to the title of this hearing, From Sanctions to the Soleimani Strike to Escalations, Evaluating the Administration's Iran Policy. I read here about Soleimani, some of the facts I grasped about him, and I think most of these are already known. He was Iran's top and most powerful general. He joined the Revolutionary Guard in 1979 during the Iranian hostage crisis, which I remember very well. He rose to their top leader quickly, commander of the Iran's Quds Force, the elite unit responsible for Revolutionary Guard's foreign operations. He also was considered a nemesis to the U.S. in the Middle East, with American officials blaming him for the deaths and maiming of thousands of American soldiers and the regional allies. David Petraeus, the former commander of the U.S. force in Iraq, described him as a truly evil figure. Before his death, Soleimani was called a living martyr of the revolution by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah al-Khamenei. So he was already considered a martyr for the cause. We just sent him to his rightful place. He did occasionally interfere in Iran's domestic policy. Dr. Haass, you talked about, how Iran, the citizens rose up in 2009. Let me tell you about this guy. In July 1999, Soleimani co-signed a letter warning President then Mohammad Khatami that the Revolutionary Guard would put down large student protests if he didn't. He was a bad player. I mean, nobody's disputing that. I want to pivot over to the JCPOA. We were here when that was negotiated, and I remember very clearly John Kerry saying no deal is better than a bad deal. That was a terrible deal, and I applaud Donald Trump for pulling out of that. How binding was the JCPOA, in your opinion?
Well, it was binding because the President of the United States entered into it. We entered into it not unilaterally, but with our allies. So
Was it signed by anybody?
Physically signed, it was signed certainly by the Secretary of State. So he represents the United States. Congress, I think, is a large.
It was never voted on. So if I don't sign an agreement to buy a house or a car, if I don't sign the contract,
the fact that
it's
it
not
wasn't
binding.
No, I disagree with you, sir. When the Secretary of State of the United States, speaking for the President, enters into an international agreement, like it or not, that's speaking for the United States.
Did our Senate sign it, pass it?
Yeah,
The
we enter
President
into
sign it?
all sorts of international arrangements that are not passed under the treaty procedures of the Constitution, in many cases are not voted on. That's a legitimate question about whether we've moved away from the two branches working together in terms of international agreements.
I got to take my time back. It was a bad deal, and President Trump did well. The release of the money, John Kerry sat here, and we said, was that money going to go into the hands of terrorist groups? And he says, more than likely, yes, it would. He sat right here and said that, and I think we can speak loudly today, and we can see the results of that. We're talking a lot about imminent threat. Imminent threat is that Iran capturing our Navy personnel in January of 2016. Was that an imminent threat? Is it the attacks on the oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz? Or is that an imminent threat? What about Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels taking out the Saudi petroleum pipelines or firing at U.S. naval ships? What about the killing of U.S. citizens and injuring 4 other service members? When is an imminent threat imminent? Do we wait for the next one and say, golly, maybe the next one will be imminent? President Trump did the right thing. And the other thing we don't talk about is the other terrorist that got taken out, Mahdi al-Mohandes. He orchestrated attacks on U.S. and French embassies in 1993. It is time that somebody takes these people out. Go back to Bill Clinton. If you read the book Dereliction of Duty by Robert Patterson, he was offered Osama bin Laden over 10 times. He refused to either capture or to eliminate him. The question is, would 9/11 happen had Bill Clinton done his job? What would happen if President Trump had not done this? What would have happened if George Bush or President Obama would have removed Soleimani or Mohandes when they had the opportunity? Would we have had our servicemen and women killed or maimed? And so this question about was this the right thing or not, leadership is tough. Harry Truman said, if you can't stand the smoke, get out of the kitchen. President Trump did what he had to do, and this country is safer for it, and I think the world is safer, and they're going to look at America and said, thank you for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating.
Well, thank you. The people that I represent in discussions, they've got one question. Are we less safe now than we were before? And I think this is an important hearing because I think the answer to that question is much more fundamental than just dealing in the prism of the killing of Soleimani? Are we safer with this maximum pressure campaign that we have? And that campaign to date has not been successful. I think that's clear. And part of the reason, maybe the major reason, is no diplomatic arm attached to that. There's no intermediaries there. The idea is beat them to submission and capitulation and then dictate the response of any negotiations. That's perceived no other way by the Iranians than a regime change. Are we safer with the resultant effects on our military? We've moved more and deployed more troops to that region, away from other areas, away from dealing with the threat of ISIS. Are we safer as we move our limited naval assets through that region, taking them away from South China Sea and the other parts of the world? And importantly, are we safer with this go-it-alone strategy that we have? You know, and that's just not a minor thing. That's something we have that our enemies don't have, an historic coalition with our allies. That's a huge difference maker, maybe the biggest, I believe. And what's happened here? We don't give them notice, and that's just not about the killing of Soleimani. That's about the troop withdrawal in Syria, where our allies had troops on the ground, uninformed, until, according to a hearing we had recently, maybe hours, that we were going to pull out of there. The INF Treaty, our delay in Ukraine in terms of military assets there, the Qatar Gulf crisis, the TPP. You can go on and on. We are just not consulting with our coalition. We're turning our back, making unilateral actions, and then saying, you better get in line. We're not safer because of that. We pulled out of the JCPO unilaterally. And then, using our own economic powers, are putting pressure on our own allies to get out themselves, instead of talking with them in an agreement that we joined in together. So if we're going to have an answer to are we less safe now, I'm glad we're talking about these fundamental issues and not getting caught up in an incident-by-incident cycle of escalation where there's a shoot-from-the-hip kind of action, then there's a policy kind of filler after that, telling everyone in Congress, everyone in America, everyone that's our allies, well, you better get in line with us after we do it, and have a cycle of escalation and having that danger where the only alternative we're leaving ourselves is militarily. Can you talk about the bigger picture here and how these actions make us less safe, give us less alternatives going forward? And this is, we just can't continue in action where we're dealing with individual incidents. We've got to take this further.
Is that aimed at any particular one of us or all?
I want you to jump in. Go ahead.
I'll just make a very short comment. Look, I think one of the structural and strategic advantages this country enjoys, and it's been one of the reasons we've been as successful as we've been now since World War II, or even going back to World War II, is our network of alliances. We, unlike China, unlike Russia, Soviet Union, except when it could coerce alliances, we have real allies, and that allows us to leverage our capabilities. And it worked tremendously in the Gulf War, but it's helped keep the peace in Asia, and obviously in Europe. So it's demonstrated to be effective, and I think we ought to revive it wherever we can in dealing with the issues we're talking about here today. I also think, just as an aside, it's not the subject of today, but the only way we can begin to deal with global challenges is collectively. The very nature of these challenges does not allow any country on its own to effectively contend with them. But so I don't think you'll get a lot of argument about the structural advantage and the case, if you will, for collective action.
My understanding is from Brian Hook, who I'm sure has testified before this committee, that at the opening days of the administration, they had the view that the nuclear agreement was inadequate because it didn't close the door on Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and the prior administration had not addressed ballistic missiles or Iranians' activities in the region, that Brian was designated to try to work with the European allies to come up with a common approach to address those three things, and was unable to do so. The administration then has adopted a strategy to try to address these issues. We don't know whether it's going to work at this point. We're in mid-course. My understanding is they continue to talk to our European allies about these issues, and particularly about the nuclear issues. And if we get a negotiation started, which I think is the thing we need to do to keep this from escalating further.
My time is, if I could, Mr. Chairman, just
It'll
for
be
20
with the
seconds. I want to say this. I was asked by this administration to get involved when we were discussing this with our European allies, to see if we can get them on board. You know, I've been talking to our allies personally, and the chances of them walking away from this was zero. And when I told them that, you know what their response was? I said, what's your contingent plan then? And they said, well, we're working on it. That's the problem. Well, we're working on it. They act impulsively and then, well, we're working on it. That's the point. It's well and good to say we had the discussions. Believe me, I was privy to a lot of that. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It's a couple of points. On the ballistic missile issue, I remember somebody testifying, and I asked them if, with this nuclear deal, if they included ballistic missiles or tried in that, and they said, well, we did at the beginning, but we knew Iran would never agree, so we dropped it. I was like, okay, well, that's a problem there. So a couple of points. You know, I hear a lot about the safer question, and it makes for good headlines. I want to say, first off, for the military, their job, the military's prime job is not to be safe. It is to keep the American people safe. And so the military as an end state, and if the end state is avoid using the military, we don't necessarily need one at that point except for a defense force. Their job is to keep us safe. And so that gets thrown around a lot. But I've been clear and consistent ever since I've been in Congress. So I supported the administration go into Libya. And I said that that was not something that needed to come to Congress. I can't say that for everybody in here, that they were consistent on both sides and all that either. But I think what's clear, and I would love if, you know, on every one of these strikes that the administration would come to Congress and we could have a debate without, of course, it being an open and revealing plans and opportunities. But what's clear is when this strike happened on day one, on moment one, the second this news came out, I had many of my friends on the other side of the aisle that immediately opposed what happened. And I dare say that a lot of people that were out making comments probably didn't even know Mr. Soleimani's name until he was killed. And so we look at what that kind of knee-jerk reaction is, and then the follow-on of this is going to escalate into World War III. We heard that on more than one occasion. Obviously, there's no World War III right now. And I want to look at the history of how we got to this point anyway. So the other thing people say is, well, now they're going to attack through the proxies. I ask, what's new? I'll tell you, in 2008 and 9, I was in Iraq. I flew ISR. We operated against both, obviously, insurgents in Iraq, but also against Iranian influence in Iraq. Many of my colleagues here did the same thing. They killed 600, estimates 400 to 600, of my fellow men and women in uniform. They've been using their proxies ever since. I remember under the prior administration, when we were talking about the ISIS fight, the concern was when ISIS was defeated that the Iranian proxies would turn against the American presence in Iraq. So this isn't a new response. And so what I would argue is if you look over the years of history of Iran, and specifically the years of history of Soleimani, it was nothing but attacks and provocations against the United States of America. In fact, many of us on both sides of this aisle were actually upset with the administration responding to they say drone attack. It's the equivalent of the economic damage of destroying 10 F-16s, by the way, because of the cost. Many of us were upset with the administration oil fields. And then when the response finally comes, the first time the United States has taken kinetic military action against Iran in response to the many provocations from Iran, they target the one man that is responsible for these provocations and not 100 people that are working a few surface-to-air missile sites because it wouldn't be escalatory. And then the response was, we're escalating. And then we see this unfortunate, tragic shoot-down of the Ukrainian airliner. And many of my colleagues here started claiming it was a response because of the United States escalation. They, in essence, blame the shoot-down of the airliner. Yeah, the Iranians pulled, but we would not be here if it wasn't for the United States. And I would remind you that when we killed Soleimani, the Iranians chose to escalate by attacking our bases in Iraq. And in full expectation of a response by the U.S. president, they had their air defense systems on high alert. And that's when that happened. The president showed great resolve and great restraint to not respond. I don't know if I'd have made the same decision, but I think he made the right decision. So we hear a lot about impulsive actions and without thinking things through. And then just briefly on the JCPOA. I'm not going to get to the argument of whether billions of dollars was given to Iran or whether it was their assets. It's nuance, it's whatever, okay? That's academic arguments. But what I do know is prior to the JCPOA, Iran was a player in the region, but not a huge one. I know that on the heels of signing the JCPOA, the legitimate government in Yemen was overthrown, and a civil war was started there by Iranian proxies. By the way, they've sent not $1 of humanitarian aid to Yemen. I know that Syria, the presence of Iranians in Syria showed up immediately after the JCPOA. Maybe it was the money, maybe it was because they felt untouchable. But when you look at regional behavior, that is essential to curtail. And I would argue that the destruction and the killing of Soleimani, all the doomsday scenarios that my friends have predicted have not come true yet. They may, but that's not going to be a result of the United States. It's going to be a result of the decisions and behavior by Iran in the region. I had questions, but I don't have time for them. So with that, I thank all the witnesses for being here and spending the time today and your expertise. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your years of service to our country. I'd like to first start by acknowledging the loss of Nawaz Walid Hamid, who was a resident of Sacramento County, the area that I represent, the American contractor, and our hearts go out to his family. And you know, it is important for us as the United States of America to protect our citizens and our men and women that are around the world. With that, you know, it's unfortunate that we're seeing such partisan dialogue here. I mean, none of us thinks Soleimani was a good guy. All of us agree that, you know, he supported proxies that had the specific intent of disrupting the Middle East and moving us away. And, you know, I think the frustration that many of us have, and I would hope folks on the Republican side of the aisle feel the same way, is the decision-making process. We've had a joint decision-making process that has served our country well, that has been methodical. And, you know, I think, Mr. Hadley, you and I have chatted about that decision-making process where you do bring in dissenting opinions. You do, unless there is that imminent threat, and thus far the administration hasn't been able to explain to us what the imminent threat was, and in fact, it does not appear that there was, at this particular moment in time, et cetera, that they had to act spontaneously. It serves our country to actually go through that methodical process and understand the consequences of our actions. We may still take those actions, but if the administration and Congress are on the same page, it does project strength as opposed to the lack of strength and cohesion. And I think that's what has many of us on the Democratic side, and again, I would hope the Republican side, frustrated with this administration. Maybe Ms. Haines or Mr. Hadley, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had discussions about removing Mr. Soleimani and came to a different discussion. Was there a joint decision-making process that took place in both administrations that you could talk about? They weighed the consequences of these actions, is that correct? And came to a different conclusion.
Congressman, it's a good question, and I'm going to answer on the basis of my own imperfect recollection, and some of my colleagues may have a different view. I do not remember the issue of taking out Soleimani coming to the formal NSC process. I know that General Stan McChrystal, in the winter issue of Foreign Policy, has said that in January of 2007, he was monitoring a convoy in which he believes Soleimani was present, and he contemplated taking him out at that point in time, decided not to do so. Again, my colleagues may disagree. I'm not aware that that came to the White House either before, during, or after that decision. It was an operational decision. So We did not have, so far as I can recall, formal consideration of that.
And Ms. Haines, within the Obama administration?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. In the Obama administration, and again, also with my personal recollection, there was not a particular decision teed up in the formal process whether we should take action or not in a particular scenario. But certainly the question of Soleimani was much discussed, and the IRGC was much discussed, and so on. And I think, you know, in general, the consequences of an action like that, as you say, would have to go through an enormous process, and certainly was one that we were thinking through, like, of what are the pros and cons. I think the fact that, you know, you have the ability to do it is not enough. I think the question is whether or not it actually is a wise decision.
And if I just play off of that, had the Iranians, had their ballistic missiles landed and killed multiple American troops, we would have been compelled to have to counter-response. Is that?
Absolutely.
And there was that possibility of an Iranian counter-response. So while I am happy we find ourselves in a place where dialogue is possible and de-escalation is possible, it was entirely possible a different outcome could have happened here. And many of us, as we saw the missiles in the air and the tapes of these missiles, you know, were waiting to understand what actually happened. And I think many of us and the American people were concerned that we were about to go into another war. Is that an accurate, you know, is that how you felt as you were watching that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the point is, I don't think any of us question whether or not a response is appropriate. I think the question is, how do you design the response to be best fit within the strategy that you're dealing with and to keep the American people safe more generally? And that's the question that I suspect many people have concern about with respect to this strike.
Right, and again, just you know, as a final statement, our country is better served when the administration and Congress are working together, having dialogue. Even if we disagree, we can disagree behind closed doors in confidence, but when we step out there, especially if we're on a path to war or confrontation, we're better served if we're working together and there's dialogue between the administration and Congress, and that did not happen in this particular case.
Fully agree.
Thank you. Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, it's important that to note that the decision to strike Qasem Soleimani was a product of a joint decision-making process. First off, I want to thank all the witnesses who are here. We have a lot of service represented, national security advisors, and CIA and state, and I just want to thank all of you for your distinguished service to our country. The intelligence community, DOD, State Department all conclude there was an imminent threat. Do any of the witnesses here dispute the conclusions of all of these different agencies?
Well, two things, sir.
I do not. I do not.
I've not seen a clear case that there was an imminent threat, and I've not seen clear evidence that everyone agrees there was an imminent threat. So I'll just say that I've not seen anything that would allow me to judge that there was.
So you're disputing the positions of Intel, DOD, and State?
The short answer is I've not seen evidence published. I can't confirm it. I can't support it because I haven't seen the evidence.
Okay. Have you seen the IRGC statement that was put out after the killing of Qasem Soleimani?
I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
There was a statement the IRGC put out right after the killing of Soleimani. Does anybody speak Farsi? I don't know. Okay, I just didn't know the answer to that question. So the IRGC did put out a statement. I request unanimous consent to offer it into the record. Mr. Chair?
Yes, without objection.
The IRGC's statement, and I mentioned this on the floor during debate last week, as well as through social media and other interviews, but most importantly on the floor, and I'm going to do it again during this hearing. The IRGC's statement after the killing of Qasem Soleimani says that Soleimani was in Iraq when he was killed to confront Americans. So if for anyone who has the position that there's not a shred of evidence that there was an imminent threat, let's start off with the IRGC's own words of why Qasem Soleimani was in Iraq. In the IRGC's words, he was there for a confrontation with Americans. Open sourced information is enough to determine that it was legitimate to take out Qasem Soleimani. You have a designated terrorist who's running a designated terrorist organization. He was being sanctioned by the United States, the EU, the United Nations. He had already killed over 600 U.S. troops. He had wounded thousands more. We just had the embassy attack right before that strike. We just had the killing and wounding of Americans just before that strike. In my opinion, when I hear some of my colleagues, including the speaker, say that it was disproportionate to take out Qasem Soleimani, I ask the question, at what point is it proportionate? How many more Americans would have to be killed in order for it to be proportionate? How many thousands of more troops would have to be wounded in order for it to be proportionate? And I would also note in correcting the record, and I mean, I don't know if anyone has an answer. I mean, we could call it a rhetorical question, but at what point would I don't know if do any of you have the position that it was disproportionate?
I think there are a number of things that you just said. One is, just to be clear, because I think sometimes this gets said publicly, the fact that you are a designated terrorist for purposes of sanctions does not provide authority to take action, lethal action certainly, against that individual. There is sort of a domestic legal analysis and then an international legal analysis that has to occur. And obviously, as a member of Congress, you also get concerned about whether or not Congress needed to have authorized the action, essentially.
Well, I have a limited amount of time, so let me ask you a follow-up question on that. Did President Obama have the authority to conduct the drone strikes in 2011 in Libya, targeting Gaddafi?
Yes.
Okay,
so the Department of Justice has, over the years, essentially concluded that the President has the authority and the power to take action under the Constitution where there is an important national interest to protect for the United States without congressional authorization, but you provide a war powers report. If you remain in hostilities for 60 days, then essentially Congress has to authorize it, or you bring your forces home.
I appreciate that. It's also important to note that President Obama, the Obama administration, their legal justification was under the AUMF. Ma'am, I'm sure that, I mean, we're not going to, I have a limited amount of time, but I'll be happy to talk to you offline or show you any products that were put out by the administration. With my limited time, I just want to say to the Iranian protesters who are out there right now, who want prosperity, stability, freedom, they want a better way of life. There are many here who are watching in the United States Congress, in the United States, wishing them the best, wanting a better future with vision and hopes for their nation. So for all those Iranian protesters who are out there right now in search of a better future, we're watching, we're praying, and wish it works out in the best for you and want to be supportive however is appropriate. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Chairman, I first want to express my disappointment that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is not here today to answer substantive questions that we have regarding this particular issue. He's here when he comes every year for budget issues, as I'm sure he will be coming around in a couple of months. And we have been very supportive of increasing the budget for the State Department. In fact, while facing dramatic cuts, we had a bipartisan effort to ensure that the State Department continues to be funded robustly. And so I'm disappointed that he's not here to answer any questions. But I want to say that although I was not here when the JCPOA was adopted, I recognize that, in fact, it wasn't a fully strong document, but it was a good beginning. It certainly didn't have anything regarding fighting or ensuring that Iran funds some bad actors in the world, or that it steps away from its interballistic missile program. But it was a start, and what I hear from the inspectors is that, in fact, they complied with most of the provisions of that, if not all of the provisions of that agreement. So my questions to you individually, and this is a yes or no answer question, is whether or not you feel or you gather enough information or evidence that, from the inspectors or otherwise, that you feel that Iran comply with the provisions established by the JCPOA. Mr. Haass, do you feel that they comply? Yes or no?
Based on everything I've read, the international inspectors made the case that Iran was in compliance.
Ms. Haines?
Yes, same.
Mr. Hadley?
So far as I know, yes.
Okay, so do you feel that the region now, or our allies in the region, are safer now today than they were after the signing of the agreement? Mr. Haass?
Whether our allies are safer than they were.
The region
2015?
and our allies in the region, yes. Israel, other allies that we have in the regions, and the region itself, is it safer now than it was after the signing of the agreement?
In terms of the nuclear threat from Iran?
In general, including the nuclear threat.
Well, in general, I would say the region has continued to deteriorate. So I think most of the countries and people of the Middle East are less safe than they were 5 years ago for a host of reasons.
Okay. Ms. Haines?
Yeah, I have nothing to add.
Mr. Hadley?
They're less safe overwhelmingly because of Iran's destabilizing activities.
But do you think that the deterioration of the destabilization of Iran to some degree had some connection with this administration ripping up the agreement, the JCPOA?
No, I think as I think one of the members said, their destabilizing activities were ongoing before the JCPOA, and if anything, they stepped up after the JCPOA, long before President Trump decided to withdraw in 2018.
Let me just say that I also think that, in fact, it was a good start. I'm not arguing that things could have not gotten better, including that aspect of our discussion. But it was a great start, and to rip it up and sort of like go to ground zero and start again, and throwing our allies under the bus, we assembled one of the most impressive coalitions of foreign governments to fully back this agreement, and we walked out on them and we threw them under the bus. I don't think that we're going to be able to assemble them again for any significant operation there. Do you think that we can assemble them again, Mr. Haass?
I think so, and I hope so. I'm not nearly as pessimistic as you there. And again, today's report suggests that the allies are not walking away from the need to work together to contend with the Iranian threat. Let me say 30 seconds very quickly, Congressman. I think it's possible to have doubts about the JCPOA, to see it in some way as flawed, at the same time to be critical of the administration for having exited it unilaterally. I think it's possible to manage both thoughts simultaneously.
Ms. Haines?
Thank you. I think the one thing that I would like to add is on a rare moment of disagreement with Mr. Hadley, I really do believe that Iran's destabilizing activities increased measurably after President Trump withdrew from the agreement and began to exercise his maximum pressure campaign, and largely because there really wasn't that diplomatic off-ramp, and this was the way for Iran to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to conclude by saying that I'm cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's been three fundamental questions that have been posed by many on both sides in the panel, and that was it wise, was it imminent, and was it a choice? And I want to talk about all those three things, maybe in a euphemism or a comparison. I look at Soleimani as a terrorist nest, as a terrorist machine gun nest, really. He's been spraying rounds at the U.S. for many years on many different fronts. So if I look at him like a terrorist machine gun nest, and I ask myself, number one, is it a choice to take that nest out? This is something I have very specific experience with on the theaters of war and in our battlefields. Yeah, it's a choice to take that out all day long. But it's not really a choice when you consider that if you leave that there, walk around it, ignore it, that somebody else is going to come across that nest eventually, and they're going to get shot at. You want to ask, is it wise? Well, I think it probably always defies conventional wisdom to go out there and attack a machine gun nest. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be done. And then you want to ask, is it imminent? Well, just because this machine gun nest might be taking a moment to reload, that doesn't mean that it's not an imminent threat. It just got done firing rounds over at our embassy. over the last number of years, had been working to attack our service members time and time again. Just because it was taking a breather to reload, that didn't mean it wasn't an imminent threat, because it wasn't literally pushing the button on something. Now I want to ask a question. Some people might call this rhetorical, but I'm not going to ask it as rhetorical. There's a number of my colleagues still remaining here. I am more than willing to yield to any of my colleagues that want to answer this question. If you walk out this hallway and you take a right and another right and another right, you're going to come to several beautiful walls that have the names of our fallen service members from the War on Terror. And I would ask, can any of you provide me one name on that wall that doesn't justify killing Soleimani? I got 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I'll be more than happy to sit here and wait. Somebody provide me with a name on that wall that does not justify his killing.
Well, the gentleman may continue.
I'm continuing, Mr. Chairman. I got 2 minutes remaining. I will sit here and wait for somebody to provide me with a name on that wall that does not justify the killing of Soleimani.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. I think you've made your point. Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, I have not yielded back my time, and I still have a minute and 45 seconds
You're disrupting the procedures right now.
I will not yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
You're disrupting
I
the
have a
procedures,
minute and
Mr.
45
Mast.
seconds remaining, of which I would like to wait for somebody to provide me with a name of somebody on our memorial wall who does
You're out
not
of order, Mr.
justify
Mast.
the killing of Soleimani.
You are out of order.
I will not yield back my time.
You are out of order, Mr. Mast.
I will not yield back my time. I am not out of order.
Mr.
You are
Chair,
out of
I'll
order,
yield a
Mr.
minute.
Chairman, for reclaiming this time.
Mr. Chair, I'll yield a minute of my time to Mr. Mast.
Oh, he's got time.
Thank you. Thank you, my colleague. I appreciate it.
Mr. Phillips doesn't have any time. Just wait for Mr. Mast's time to expire. Okay, when is this? It's now Mr. Phillips' time. To the add, someone add things to it? No, because he didn't have time. No, 1:30 or whatever. Yeah, it's his time. Only his time? Yeah, it's a Mast's time. This is how he takes his time.
Okay.
Just call Mr. Phillips.
Why did Phillips give him an extra minute? It was what? So is that the thing here?
Yeah, so Phillips has a right to say so he didn't have any time.
Yeah.
It's Mast's.
Okay.
He has a right to read it out.
Okay.
And then you call Mr. Phillips once it's done.
Just tell me when.
Mr. Chair, if I might begin?
Yeah,
Thank you for yielding me your time, although I did not yield my time back. I thank you. I will note that there was no response of one name offered that did not justify the killing of Soleimani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mast. I'm grateful that you took that time because you humanize an issue that all too often is not. And having just returned from the Arabian Gulf, visiting bases with many of my colleagues sitting in here right now, Mr. Zeldin, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Mr. Cicilline, I come to you and to this hearing with everybody with whom we met on those bases on my mind. I want to start by echoing my colleagues' disappointment in the fact that Secretary Pompeo chose not to come today. I say that not politically, but from a governance perspective. And I've appreciated today's debate and conversation. I think good arguments have been made on both sides, but I do not want to cover the same ground. I want to talk about something that I think we have to, and that is our authorizations, our AUMFs. We, of course, have two in effect right now, the 2001, 2002. And I want to ask each of you, if you believe, in light of the current circumstances in the Middle East and in the Gulf region, if it is time
to craft a new AUMF? And if so, how should we do so? What should its components be, and how might we begin looking at that? Dr. Haass, if you might begin.
The honest answer is I haven't thought it completely through, but I am increasingly inclined in the direction of yes. That ones that simply deal with threats from terrorism or obviously Iraq are inadequate. And we've already discussed here today 2 scenarios involving Iran. One is the possibility that Iran breaks out significantly from the 2015 JCPOA, and we're faced with a consequential decision whether to undertake a classical preventive military strike. The other is to deal with situations where Iran continues to attack its neighbors or continues to attack U.S. individuals or forces through using whatever set of tools, and we decide it's important to retaliate. So, we don't need an AUMF, just to be clear, for situations where imminence is in play.
Of course.
That's the right of self-defense. So let's take that off the board. So the real question is whether we would need an AUMF. And I increasingly think yes, in terms, because of the nuclear situation. I think it sends some useful messages to Iran about our collective preparedness. I don't think war powers is adequate, because war powers gives the administration, war powers is the wrong approach for 2 reasons. One, it allows administrations to act unilaterally, and then it raises questions about our staying power. So I think war powers is counterproductive for both reasons. I do think, though, that it would be very smart that if an AUMF were passed, that it be effectively coupled or passed simultaneously with the introduction of a new diplomatic initiative.
Indeed.
And I think the 2 could very much go hand in hand. That is my tentative thinking, but I think you raised a big question.
Thank you,
And
sir.
a good one.
Ms. Haines.
Thank you, Congressman. I do think this is a critical issue, and the sort of opportunity for Congress to get more involved in shaping what, in fact, the authority for the use of force abroad is critical in my view. I think, as an initial matter, I think you should be replacing the 2001 AUMF that relates to counterterrorism. I think it is time for that to be updated and to be consistent with how Congress believes the administration, and successive administrations should, in fact, prosecute that conflict. I think that the Iraq AUMF, the 2002 Iraq AUMF, should be repealed. That's something that we voiced our support for in the Obama administration, and the president then called for. I'm not aware of any military operations that have to rely on that AUMF. And I think this question of what should be the authorization to use military force against Iran, if at all, is one that, in many respects, it seemed to me that your concurrent resolution passed recently, the Slotkin resolution, it is one that sort of lays out what you view to be the situation right now, and does so quite eloquently in the context of the current crisis, in a sense, with Iran. So I would support seeing that come to a vote, but taking further action on the existing AUMFs and expanding. Thank you, sir.
We've got about 15 seconds, Mr. Hadley.
There are new circumstances, there are new contingencies. If you could get agreement on AUMF, it would provide a firmer foundation for action if it was required. There's an awful lot of confusion here. This whole issue about imminent attack is not an issue about the president's constitutional authority, which is much broader than that. It really comes as a function of international law. I don't know why it is so front and center the way it is. And I would say the AUMF has to be in that process. Be careful that not only vindicating congressional authorities, but providing enough flexibility for the president to act. And to say the president could only act, for example, under the basis of an attack on America or an imminent attack is much too narrow and would, I think, be real folly.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service. Thank you for being here today. Regarding the JCPOA, would you or would you not agree that for such an agreement to work, the signatories to that agreement, the members of that agreement, must be telling the truth and acting in good faith? Mr. Haass?
It sounds like the sort of, I must be missing something. Would that be different than any other international agreement?
I'm just saying, for this one in particular.
Well, I mean,
Do you believe that those two qualities must be present for an agreement
if I
to work?
may quote Mr. President Reagan, you trust but you verify. I assume countries go into international agreements for any number of reasons. In some cases, they may want to deceive. That's why there has to be adequate verification. I don't take anyone's word for it.
But do you believe that we should assume in entering such an agreement that the signatories are acting in good faith?
I would not assume that. That's why I believe verification and monitoring are essential.
Ms. Haines?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Dr. Haass is reflecting, in many agreements, for example, in the context of arms control, and the JCPOA is no different, the fact is you don't trust the partner across the table from you, in a sense. You're trying to construct a regime that gives you the confidence, nevertheless, to take certain actions in order to manage a threat.
Mr. Hadley?
I have nothing to add.
Yep. What I'm getting at here to the panel, do you believe that the Iranian regime tells the truth and acts in good faith?
With this agreement, they complied with it. I do not believe, however, in any way they gave up their long-term goal of preserving the option to develop a nuclear weapons capability.
Would that be a yes or a no, sir?
Well, Congressman, not every question lends itself to a yes or no. They were complying with the letter of the agreement. I do think Iran was preserving its nuclear weapons options.
I think the whole construct around the JCPOA is to avoid a situation in which you have to rely on simply a statement from the Iranian government that says we're complying. We actually created the verification and monitoring regime just to deal with that issue and to provide us with greater insight so that we could credibly judge for ourselves whether or not compliance was occurring and rely on additional third parties like the IAEA to tell us.
I think because there was so little trust in the Iranian regime, that is why a lot of members of Congress and others thought that the JCPOA was not adequate because it did not push off or totally eliminate the option of Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
So with the isolated kinetic strikes that took out Osama bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Qasem Soleimani, did the panel support and do you believe it was the right decision to make to conduct that raid on bin Laden, on Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, two leaders of ISIS?
I would argue yes.
Yes, I think these are very distinguishable circumstances. Thank you.
Yes.
And how are they distinguishable, Ms. Haines?
Sure. So in the context of, for example, Osama bin Laden, the head of a terrorist organization that we were at war with and that we had, in fact, an authorization to use military force against, the United States took action. I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. I don't think that, it created a circumstance in which we were taking on a new war, for example, against a whole nother nation state.
Do you believe Mr. Soleimani is the head of a terrorist organization?
I believe that Qasem Soleimani supported and engaged in terrorist action, and there's absolutely no question about that. And I don't have any, look, as I said in my testimony, as I've repeated, and I think as others have as well, I think he deserved his fate. I don't think that's the issue. I don't mourn the loss of Soleimani. I think the issue is that in every circumstance, when you're using the awesome military force of the United States and you're engaging in these issues, you have to do so as part of a strategy. And the question always occurs, is this the right target? Is this the right action to be taking in this context? And I think, as I've already identified, a whole series of consequences that I believe were actually undermined the overall objectives that both prior administration and this administration had.
Mr. Chairman, I have other questions, but I want to yield my remaining 30 seconds to my colleague, Mr. Zeldin.
I'll let you.
Yes, go.
I'll yield back to Mr. Fitzgerald.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Yield back? Okay, gentleman yields back. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the panel. With running between committees, it's really hard to be here and to hear many of the questions and the testimony that you all gave. Sorry if this question had already been asked and if you'd all have given an input to this. But Dr. Haass, I know that you've been somewhat critical of the JCPOA. Your perspective is that it's too short term. And so I'm wondering, what should a deal look like?
I think it's important to be clear about what a deal could realistically include and what it could not. I think it could include longer-term limits, ideally open-ended limits. I don't see why Iran should have the right to get close to developing a nuclear weapon in 50 years or 75 years. So I would prefer open-ended efforts, but if not that, many decades. I think it should include ballistic missiles. I think it should be verifiable. I think it has to involve sanctions relief. And I think, though, that other aspects of Iranian behavior in the region should be dealt with other ways. I don't think it's realistic to build a quote-unquote grand bargain that would resolve all of our concerns with Iran. In my experience, all-or-nothing diplomacy tends to yield nothing.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And so to you and maybe to the rest of the panel, I'm wondering, why would Iran, after we unilaterally left the JCPOA, assassinated Soleimani, destroyed their economy with our sanctions, threatened to bomb their cultural sites, why would they be willing to enter into a better deal with us at this moment?
The reason they might is, as you know, governing is about choices. The economic sanctions are having a significant toll. They could conceivably threaten the viability of the government and the revolution. So I would think that if Iran is offered significant sanctions relief, that might be something that they would countenance. They say they don't want nuclear weapons. So it ought not to change that. So I think the question is, if we can present them with a choice, I wouldn't rule out one other thing. I think we probably would need to have it voted on by the Congress. They would need to know that the next deal is not something that this or any president could unilaterally overturn. I would think they would want to have the confidence that it was truly embedded in the policy of the United States.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I guess from my perspective, I continue to hope that there is an opportunity for negotiations and diplomacy, and I think we do need to invest in that, and I, have indicated that that's one of my recommendations moving forward. I think it is very unlikely that we're going to see the Trump administration capable of bringing the Iranians to the table and negotiating a deal like that. I think that's a reality, and unfortunate as that is. Thank you.
Mr. Bradley, did you have anything to add?
I'm a little more optimistic than my good friend Avril Haines is, and I think Richard Haass said it very well, and I subscribe to his comments.
Well, I appreciate your insights, and it's, I think, quite fascinating to hear that you all think critical sanctions relief package would be on the table for Iran if it was to re-engage, more significant than that was part of the JCPOA. I'm sure that's excellent. And it seems as if there are opportunities to negotiate. So I hope that cooler heads prevail and that we deploy diplomacy and look at using many of the tools that we have in our toolbox. Because what is happening right now in the ways that things have escalated is not going to make us safer, and it's not going to alleviate the economic burdens that the civilians of Iran are facing at the moment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, over here. 2 weeks ago, President Trump ended Qasem Soleimani's brutal reign of terror that killed and maimed countless Americans and coalition forces and threatened many, many more to come. I urge all Americans to unite behind the president's defensive decision to strike one of the world's most powerful terrorists who is organizing attacks against Americans in Iraq, in defiance, I might add, of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. He shouldn't have even been in Iraq, shouldn't have been in Beirut, shouldn't have been in Damascus. For far too long, Tehran has been permitted to act with impunity against U.S. allies' interests and its personnel. I applaud the president for making our red lines clear. Clear to the Iranian regime that attacking Americans is never acceptable, and when American lives hang in the balance, Iran will be held to account for its actions. The Middle East is a safer place when the United States is clear and consistent in its intentions. Mr. Hadley, to what degree are Iran's proxies dependent on Tehran for financial, material, and technical assistance? And how successful has the United States been in preventing Iran from providing significant support to these proxy groups?
I'm not privy to intelligence anymore and haven't been for a long time on these subjects. My understanding is that the economic pressure that Iran is now under has resulted in some diminishment of the resources that are available to these groups. I think, for example, Nasrallah, who's head of Hezbollah, has actually complained that he doesn't have enough resources for his activities. So I think it is having effect based on what I've read in public sources, but I don't have the kind of intelligence sources available to me that would allow me to give you a better answer to that question.
Well, I thank you. They've clearly gone through the $150 billion plus that were sent over by the Obama administration, strapped to pallets to be used for these proxies to kill people around the globe, including our American allies and assets. After the Iranian regime admitted that it shot down Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752, tragically killing 176 passengers, and I know it's been discussed here at length, protests did erupt across the country. Mr. Hadley, how are these protests connected, do you think, to the pro-democracy, pro-economic reform demonstrations of the last few years? And do you think that this public outrage will constrain Iran's foreign policy? Can it be constrained?
It's been interesting to see how many demonstrations there have been in the last 2 years of people demanding accountability from their governments, ending of corruption, less sectarianism, governments that actually perform. You've seen it in Algeria, you've seen it in Sudan, you've seen it in Lebanon, you've seen it in Iraq, you've seen it in Iran, a lot of other places in the Middle East. This is a positive thing, and I think it is one of the sources of leverage on the Iranian regime that may make them willing to come to the table and negotiate an outcome, because they put down the demonstrations in October and November only by a fairly brutal use of force. And I think they are worried that the additional sanctions will kindle a return to those kinds of demonstrations that could threaten the regime, and is a threat to the regime, as Richard Haass said, that might bring them to the table.
I absolutely agree, and that's why I also share your bullishness on the opportunity that we have at this moment of time to bring Iran to the table for further negotiations, more now than ever. And these protests and the public outrage, I think, could really have an effect as we go forward in foreign policy and such. So there are reports that indicate that Iran has worked to reduce internet connectivity near universities, hotspots, limiting the impact of these protests. How vulnerable is the regime to information operations, and how should the U.S. be using information to target the regime's weaknesses and empower this change? Mr. Hadley?
Well, they have cut off the internet to keep demonstrators from organizing as a part of their suppression of public demonstrations, clearly. You know, our best information operation has always been truth and trying to get it to the people in these closed societies, because what is really the toxic element for them is actually truth about what's happening in the world. And I think we have not done as good a job as we should in getting truth available to people in these totalitarian or authoritarian societies.
I agree. My time has expired. I shall yield back. But here is to truth and the Iranian people.
Thank you. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I'd like to start with a question to you, Ms. Haines. Recently, I had the honor over the Christmas week of traveling to the Middle East and meeting with our troops, some of the extraordinary service members who put their lives on the line for us, and I've been thinking about those men and women an awful lot over the last couple of weeks. Last week, the President said we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. But then just this past Sunday, he tweeted, "I couldn't care less if they, the Iranians, negotiate." We in Congress, unfortunately, have been given little to no information about the administration's intelligence that they allegedly had before this strike on Soleimani. So my question to you is, in your assessment, does the President and his administration have a clear strategy to actively reduce tensions between Iran and the United States and to prevent conflict?
I think I was as encouraged as you were by the idea that they are interested in negotiating something diplomatically. I have to say, I mean, I haven't seen anything that puts together a broader strategy that would actually be likely to result in the kind of negotiations that I could imagine, hopefully, happening in the future. But, I mean, honestly, I don't know that I would know. I certainly hope that they do have something, but I hope also that they will share it if they do, so that we can actually all participate in understanding it and pushing forward on it.
So I take it from your response that you have no greater information than we do here in Congress. And as a result, you wouldn't be able to answer my follow-up question of whether the United States' national security is stronger now than it was a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I've made a case in my testimony that it's not, that I think that the action that was taken really further undermines the objectives that at least have been articulated by this administration and are actually quite consistent with the prior administration's objectives for the region. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate that we're in the place that we are, and obviously, you know, all of us need to come from here and try to make the best out of it that we possibly can. But I do think we're less safe in many respects as a consequence.
Dr. Haass, I'd like to ask you, and first I'd just like to state the obvious, I think, that while tensions between Iran and the United States revolve around many issues, none of these issues are more consequential than the possibility of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. I think we can all agree on that. In the aftermath of the strike on General Soleimani, Iran announced that it would no longer abide by the JCPOA restrictions on Iran's uranium enrichment activities, as well as restrictions on further research and development that could contribute to building a nuclear weapons program. And so my question to you is, with this as context, has the strike made it more or less likely, or neither, that Iran will ultimately be able to develop a nuclear weapon?
I'm not avoiding your question. I think the answer is it's too soon to know that. I think the U.S. decision to exit the JCPOA set in motion a chain of events which explains where we are. Because I can't answer your question, I would say two things. One is we ought to be communicating to Iran certain red lines that would be the limits to our tolerance of what they might do. And that would reflect our views, Israel's views, Arab views. We do not want Iran doing certain things. Secondly, I do think we ought to put forward, as we discussed before, an initiative that would improve upon the JCPOA and put it forward in terms that might be actually not totally unattractive, conceivably even attractive to the Iranian government, given the circumstances they find themselves in. I want to avoid a situation where we can't answer your question. And what we fear, and what could actually be, is that Iran begins to reduce the time that would be available for intelligence agencies to discern exactly how far they are away. If we ever reach that point where we simply don't know, or it starts getting close, what I would call the near nuclear option, one, we will have a big debate, as will Israel, about whether to undertake a preventive military strike. Two, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and others will begin to have their version of National Security Council meetings about whether they need to follow suit and develop nuclear weapons options of their own. And as bad as the Middle East is right now, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how much worse that Middle East would be.
So you used the term red lines, and a few minutes ago, my colleague, Ms. Wagner, used that same term. And I just realized that I'm out of time. I apologize, Mr. Chairman, and I withdraw the question.
Thank you. Gentlewoman withdraws the question. Thank you. Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here. Just a couple of comments. I want to express my full and complete support of our president. I think President Trump has done an outstanding job transitioning from a strategy of appeasement to one of credible deterrence. And I also want to express support and hope that we can muster solidarity behind the Iranian protesters. I spent many years working in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so from the perspective of both a military officer and or former military officer and a defense contractor, I think that perspective and voice might be worth hearing. When it comes to military operations, they need many things, but two things that they certainly need are speed and secrecy, or the ability to deliver in a clandestine nature. This body is incapable of both of those, of either of those things. And so when it comes to if it were a just kill, I understand the importance of striking fast and striking hard. And the justice of killing Soleimani is without question. If you were to ask me or a number of military personnel in Baghdad to strike a designated insurgent who is responsible for killing 600 of our brothers and sisters, and they were headed down Route Irish, we would grab our guns and we'd go kill them. And if that's wrong, we wouldn't want to be right. And it saddens me that we can't rally behind that. And over the mere fact that some of his compensation apparently came from the government of Iraq. I mean, think about that. That constitutes the fact that he was great as an employee of a country. Well, he's the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. So, listen, nobody wants war, particularly the American soldier, because he or she needs to fight in it. But I think I speak certainly for a lot of people that I knew when I say that the world is a safer place with one less insurgent in it. And for that matter, when it comes to safety and the very nature of credible deterrence, when we're conducting operations, you want other insurgents. You know that they can see you. You want them to know that should anything happen to you, if they want to take the risk of striking you, then a Reaper drone is going to rain hellfire down on them. And moreover, to those low-ranking foot soldier insurgents throughout the world, whatever country they're in, Syria or Lebanon or Al-Anbar, Iraq, wherever, you want them to second-guess when their choices, because if we could take out your general, we could sure as hell kill you. So I'd like to close on just reiterating my full and complete support of President Trump and his choice to go with a credible deterrence strategy, and that is in fact the strategy. I'd like to say that I've heard Soleimani being described as a martyr. Martyr is somebody willing to die at the hands of an oppressor for his or her beliefs, not a ruthless killer. I appreciate that. And again, I want to voice support for the Iranian protesters. God be with them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Zeldin.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Ms. Haines, we got rushed in our exchange there towards the end of my 5 minutes, and weren't able to do that important topic justice there at the end. So the Obama administration had airstrikes in Libya in 2011 as well as after 2011. The final decision making for that process for the strikes after 2011 were use of AUMF targeting ISIL. The final decision in the airstrikes in 2011 was under Article 2, correct?
So the initial use of force in Libya that I thought you were referencing was not done under an authorization to use military force. It was done under Article 2, as you indicated. There was a War Powers report that was provided to the Congress, and then there was essentially a discussion with the Congress on whether or not we continued to be in hostilities. And then there were, after the fall of Gaddafi and further action in the context of Libya, there was a shift, in a sense, of what the conflict was about and what the targets were, and effectively what we were trying, the threat we were trying to address. And some of it came under the 2001 AUMF, not just with respect to ISIL, but Al-Qaeda and associated forces.
Yep. I just want to make sure we get on the same page. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Allred.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by expressing my disappointment that Secretary Pompeo is not here. With the shifting rationales that the American people have been given for this strike, I think it's important that we have a public viewing and discussion about what went into this. And I think on this committee, we're going to have to be as aggressive as necessary to make sure that we're able to perform our oversight function. And I want to thank the members of the panel for being here today. I know you probably had other things planned. We appreciate you making time. I'm worried that this action has made us less safe, but I'm also worried about the reputational damage that it's done. For years, Democratic and Republican presidents have urged countries to avoid cultural and historical sites in wartime. It's against, of course, the laws of war, and it's also morally wrong. But just last week, of course, President Trump tweeted that the U.S. may strike Iranian cultural sites if Iran escalated the conflict further. Though, of course, the Department of Defense appeared to walk those comments back, Trump's remarks were widely publicized and, of course, widely criticized as well. To each of you on the panel, I just want to ask you, how do you think the people of the Middle East view those statements? How does that impact our reputation in the region? How does that undermine our ability to reach any further agreements to try and de-escalate? Dr. Haass, you want to begin?
As is implicit in your question, it obviously doesn't help. Like I think our reputation has taken a hit several ways here. One is the mention you had, sir, of the possibility of targeting cultural sites, which would also be inconsistent with what many of your colleagues have mentioned about our desire to side with the Iranian people. Going after cultural sites is not going to help us in that undertaking. I think also we've hurt ourselves a little bit on not being able to publicly back up the claim of imminence, and that's clearly hurt us in Iraq, because it makes it much harder to justify what we did. And all this doesn't take place, shall we say, absent the context, and the entire post-2003 inability to demonstrate the WMD link to Saddam. So I think what we have done is created questions about our reputation, and I think that we will pay a price for that.
Thank you, Congressman, and particularly for bringing this issue up, because I think from my perspective, I've found that I'm somebody who believes very strongly in international law. I spent most of my career working on international law, and I think it serves American interests in enormous ways. And to see the president tweet essentially what would be a war crime, as something that we should do or could do or anything along those lines, to also talk about disproportionate strikes, which is also not consistent with the law of war, to take a position like that is not just, I think, of concern to the region, but also deeply depressing, frankly, for the folks in the U.S. government who are frequently out, for example, our military, out training other militaries on what the law of war is and how it is that we should respect the law of war and the kinds of issues that we deal with. And, you know, in the context of particularly targeting cultural property, which is really, it's so much more than, you know, destroying, obviously, the bricks and mortar that you're destroying, but it's an attack on the identity, on the memory, on the dignity of a society. And, you know, this is something that we spearheaded a lot of the international law on, and we have a convention, the Hague Cultural Property Convention, that we're a party to. We're also party to one of the protocols. It's something that we've really celebrated in the United States in many respects as an issue that we should be promoting leadership on, and I found it very deeply depressing, frankly.
Thank you. Mr. Hadley?
I think it was a mistake. As you know, as you indicated, the Department of Defense began to walk it back. I think Secretary Pompeo said any strikes in Iran would be against legal targets, which of course would rule out the cultural sites. So I think it was a mistake, and I think I would not expect to see the United States attacking cultural sites.
Well, I think we sometimes fall into the bad habit of pretending that the words of the President of the United States don't matter, and that we can just have this debate as if those things weren't said, and as if we did not threaten a war crime in this region, in which we know how long some of these words can echo. I think the reason that the free world follows us and that despots and dictators fear us is because of our values, because of who we are and what the American flag and what our system of government and our values mean around the world. When we undermine that, I think we do much, much more than any insurgent attack could do to us, much more damage than any foreign country could do to us, because they cannot defeat us militarily. But we can undermine our own values abroad, and it deeply worries me, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion today.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge an old friend, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who was a member of this committee for many years in olden days when I served on it. So welcome back, Sheila. Good to see you. We have a vote, and what I could do is cut down everyone to 3 minutes to try to get in more people that we can. So let me start with Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Haass, you, in your written testimony, you do a great job of outlining some of the Iranian atrocities over the last 40 years, beginning with the 79 embassy takeover, the 83 bombing of the barracks in Beirut, the 96 Cobalt Tower bombings. You also set forth recent aggression, including attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf, the downing of an American drone, the launching of missiles that hit the Saudi oil installations, the sponsoring of militias that attack bases in Iraq, the killing of an American contractor, and the recent assault on the American embassy. You go on further to say there is no doubt that Soleimani had the blood of Americans on his hand and was a force of instability in the region. And you actually state that Soleimani was, in fact, you say here, an evil person. And then you go on at the end of page 2 to talk about that the United States should have responded to recent Iranian attacks, such as the one carried out against Saudi oil fields with attacks on Iranian economic and military assets. What should the proper response should have been? It seems to me that you are stating here that the President's use of restraint actually emboldened Iranian aggression in the Middle East. And so what would the proper response and what response should we have taken, particularly militarily? It seems to me economically that we have imposed as many sanctions as we could possibly impose, and we could continue to impose sanctions from here till hell freezes over and have no additional benefit to those. So militarily, what response should the United States have taken after the Saudi oil fields were attacked?
Two things, sir. One is I think we should have found an equivalent Iranian economic installation, and I would have supported the idea of attacking that. Two, I think it sent a very bad message to the region that we would not respond to an attack on a close partner, not like Saudi Arabia. I don't want to get the sense. I never want to communicate the sense that they are essentially adrift and they can't count on it. Thirdly, I think it raises questions for you all, and it gets back to the conversation we had previously about an AUMF that would provide a context for dealing with these kinds of acts of Iranian aggression.
And Ms. Haines, do you agree that the United States should have attacked Iran militarily after their assault on the Saudi oil fields?
Yes, I think there should have been a response, and my view is very similar to what you've described of Dr. Haass's view, and as we've been saying here, that essentially by not responding in a way it can encourage some response, but the issue is, again, taking action to manage and to deter appropriately while trying to mitigate against the consequences that are additional to any action that you take. Does that make sense?
And so would both of y'all then say that the president's use of restraint or great use of restraint you feel embolden Iran to continue to attack American interests in the Middle East?
Again, it's always hard to put yourself inside their heads, but my own take on it is yes, that they thought that they could act with a degree of impunity because they'd gotten away with shooting down a drone, attacking shipping, attacking the Saudis. I would expect there were people in Iran who basically say we can do certain things and the chances of an American physical response are modest.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Let me first say before Mr. Levin comes there, it's really interesting. It was just called to my attention that Secretary Pompeo doesn't have the time to come to this committee, but while we're holding this hearing, he did have time to go on Fox News.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Levin.
Thank you all for hanging in here with us. Last weekend, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said that 2002 Iraq war authorization gave the administration the authority to launch the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. Here's the operative text of that authorization. The President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, 1, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and 2, enforce all relevant UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. I think that language is pretty clear, and so did Defense Secretary Esper during his Senate confirmation last year. On July 16th, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Secretary told Senator Duckworth that the 2001 and 2002 authorizations to use military force did not allow the use of military force against Iran. And yet, here we are. Again, the 2002 Iraq War authorization allows the use of force to deal with the threat posed by Iraq, not a threat necessarily in Iraq or emanating from Iraq, but by Iraq. Ms. Haines, do you agree that this does not authorize the use of force against Iran? The 2002 AUMF?
Yeah, I mean, to be simple, yes. I don't think it is authorized by the 2002 AUMF, and I did hear the prior statements by the administration to at least indicate that they also did not think that.
All right, let me further ask you, if Congress fails to make clear that the 2002 war authorization, or the 2001 for that matter, does not apply to Iran, aren't we setting a dangerous precedent? What's to stop this administration or any future administration from claiming that a war authorization for one country gives them the okay to use force against another?
Yeah, so there's, classically, in my experience, the way that administrations would essentially look at an authorization to use military force, like, for example, the 2001 authorization to use military force, is that they would then consider if another actor, whether it be a terrorist organization, as it would be in that particular AUMF case, or in the context of an AUMF vis-a-vis another country, if that country entered into an alliance and was fighting against the United States, then there could be an extension of that authorization to another state in that circumstance. But I think, you know, obviously Congress has the ability to pass another joint resolution that says, in fact, that's not what we intended, and we do not, in fact, authorize.
I mean, my time's up because we're running short here, but I just think that it's clear that Congress needs to repeal the 2001 and 2002 and then do new authorizations for any situation that we think we should go to war on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you so much to the witnesses. Ms. Haines, it's so great to see you. I have been astounded listening to some of the testimony or the questions of my colleagues as we are talking through what should be a really foundational piece. What is Congress's role in the authorization of war? I've heard a lot of debate about what happened a week ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 16, 20, 25, et cetera, years ago. But what I want to move forward and talk about is the 2001 AUMF and the 2002 AUMF. And Ms. Haines, I'll start with you specifically as a follow-up to the questions posed by Congressman Phillips and Congressman Levin. The 2002 AUMF, we'll start there, authorization for our war in Iraq. To your knowledge, to restate, are there currently any operations continuing under the 2002 AUMF?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. I can't say with certainty, right, what it is that the current administration is doing. What I can tell you is that in the Obama administration, we conducted a significant number of military operations that seem quite similar to what it is, frankly, that is currently being done by the Trump administration against terrorist organizations such as al-Qaeda and associated forces, and obviously against ISIL. And we did not believe that the 2002 AUMF was necessary for us to do any of those operations, including the ones around ISIL, just to be utterly clear, including those in Iraq. And as a consequence, we supported the repeal of the 2002 AUMF, which we felt was outdated. And the president also had said that felt that it was time to replace the 2001 AUMF.
Thank you. And there seems to be some confusion among members of this body about how the killing of Osama bin Laden or al-Baghdadi were different from an authorization standpoint from the killing of Soleimani. I also think, and I'll take the opportunity to restate that those of us on this side of the aisle shed no tears for Soleimani, who I believe was a terrorist as he is classified by the U.S. government. But could you just walk us through specifically how the authorizations, what the authorizations were for the killing of Osama bin Laden and al-Baghdadi, and how that may or may not be the same or different?
Yeah, so for Osama bin Laden, the 2001 AUMF is quite clear in its authorization to use military force against al-Qaeda.
Authorization by Congress.
Authorization by Congress, absolutely. And in the case of al-Baghdadi, it's obviously under ISIL, and the theory of the Obama administration, which I assume is being used by the Trump administration, was in fact that because ISIL had a long-standing relationship with al-Qaeda and with Osama bin Laden, and a variety of other factors, including the fact that they had targeted the United States, that you could in fact authorize action against ISIL as well under the 2001 AUMF, despite the split in leadership between al-Qaeda and ISIL.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you very much for coming, and I would also like to echo my concern that Secretary Pompeo is not here today. I do have two very specific questions. One reflects on Mr. Kinzinger's conversation about the responsibility that people in the military have to understand that they won't necessarily be safe. That's their job. But we also have a responsibility in Congress and with the administration to make sure that we are deploying them effectively and that we're keeping them as safe as possible by using the other resources and tools in the toolbox that we have, which is diplomacy and humanitarian efforts. And so my question to you directly is, what happens now that we've sent thousands of troops into the Middle East in terms of our efforts in Russia or against China and the concern of great powers?
I made the criticism the other day that I thought sending more troops to the Middle East right now lent, the phrase I used was strategic incoherence. This administration has articulated publicly the need for much greater emphasis on great powers, the challenge they pose, and its entire bias was to dial down the American emphasis on the greater Middle East. I thought they went too far in what they did in Syria. This is clearly inconsistent with it. So I would think it's, given the administration's own lights, it would make a good deal of sense to try to stabilize things. I think that does involve, as you suggested, a greater emphasis on diplomatic tools. In the short run, though, it may now be necessary to have those troops there because we have created We have, if you will, poked a stick in the hornet's nest, but I'm hoping it is not this does not become the new normal, because the impact on readiness, the impact on what would be available elsewhere would be, I think, unfortunate.
And thank you. I'm sorry that I don't have time to ask the rest of you, because I have one second question, which is that the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is set to expire now on October 18th, what, if anything, should we be doing to make sure that we are thinking about and address the expiration of that resolution? It's the resolution that expresses the importance that Iran is prohibited from exporting or purchasing any arms. This is what President Trump is talking about when he says that everything is set to expire, and that's part of the reason why he exited the JCPOA.
Yeah, and your question is just...
Is there anything that we can do here in this body, given that the UN, that is set to expire?
Right. I mean, I think obviously you can support the administration and push them to essentially look for extensions of any restrictions that you think are appropriate under.
And in what ways should our policy change if Iran was able to sell and acquire combat systems as a consequence of this? With my 4 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, as a preliminary matter, what you want to do is see what they do, and in fact, whether or not they can push out conventional arms more than they already do. We already have policy that actually tries to counter those issues as it is, and we would obviously want to increase, depending on whether or not they are increasing their exports of such conventional arms.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Mr. Trone.
Dr. Haass, just quickly, prior to the assassination, we had real protests in the streets against the Iran, and they had a war for over 8 years. 100,000 Iraqis died, 100,000 Iranians died, and we were moving in a little bit of positive direction on the anti-Iran feeling in Iraq. Now that's all swung back. What do you think this recent events, this new trajectory, is going to do on Iraq's pro-reform movement and the protest movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Iraqis have considerable nationalism. And the fact that because they're Shia and Iran is obviously Shia, that somehow there's not nationalism in Iraq, I don't think that's true. My guess is also Iran will overplay its hand. So I think it's probably wrong to underestimate Iraqi pushback against Iran. Again, it's also one of the reasons, I think we all agree here 100%, that it's so important for the United States to repair its relationship with Iraq, because I think that will give Iraqis a basis and some confidence for pushing back against Iran. I don't want Iran to have a free hand inside Iraq.
Okay, we got to run for votes.
Okay. I want to first ask very quickly unanimous consent that Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee be allowed to participate today, and giving her 1 minute.
Let me quickly say that I have not seen any depth of support by the American people for a war with Iran. I clearly believe it is important for us to explain that Article 1 does say that Congress declares war. It does give Article 2 powers of defending the nation. I do think the issue of imminent danger was and should be explained to the American people, and we should be truthful about it. So I have 2 questions. One, do we believe that any engagement with Iran prospectively and some resolution is at this point hopeless? I truly believe under President Obama, when we worked tirelessly for the non-nuclear agreement, that we had something that would allow us a moment to engage. And then anyone wants to comment on this completely upside-down explanation of imminent and the fact that there was no definitive definition or reasoning behind Secretary Pompeo's advice or the Secretary of Defense's advice to the President of the United States.
Well, you've got 2 seconds according to this, but maybe we can give you 30 seconds.
I don't think it's hopeless. I think that it would, do such things as no longer supporting regime change, making it clear that we're willing to talk. I think putting sanctions relief on the table, conditionally tied to Iranian behavior. I think that against the backdrop of sanctions, I think that there's a possibility, certainly worth pursuing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to have to adjourn. Because
thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy.
Thank you. I want to thank our 3 witnesses. I've been on this committee a long time, and I think all of you are just excellent, and I really do appreciate your coming here and and speaking with us today, and we hope to have you back. Thank you. Committee's now adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.